and welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I'm your host, Courtenay, and I'm super passionate about moving and thinking. On this show, we are going to dive into all things health, fitness, personal development, lifestyle, and political sociocultural. I've always been fascinated by people, and I love learning from the experiences and stories of others. This has been a treat for me, and I hope this is enjoyable and useful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or any way that I can make this a better experience for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Hello, welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I'm here today with John Klyczek. He is a professor of rhetoric and research argumentation. These are not things that are taught very often these days, but he teaches them. And he is also an author, and this is one of his latest books, The School World Order, which is a master of research. So I'm really excited to dive into this today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Likewise, I'm excited to have you here. So let's start with what made you decide to be a professor of those subjects? And secondly, what made you write this book? We'll start with the first. Yeah.
Okay. So I actually kind of wanted to do like a general humanities degree because I like all the various arts. And I also like philosophy. I didn't want to like pick one, right, and then not be able to do the others. And they didn't have a humanities discipline at my college. So English to me was the best sort of middle ground because to study English literature in particular, you need to be aware of the historical period that the piece was written in. And you need to be aware of the philosophical ideas that influence the history of the time and the culture. And oftentimes, the literature itself mirrors the visual arts or the musical arts. And so it was a nice way to sort of, synthesize all of those without having like a, liberal arts degree or a humanities degree. And then I got into rhetoric largely because as an adjunct, that you don't get to teach literature as an adjunct. That's basically for full timers, and they're not. As an adjunct, you generally teach gen ed, so you're going to teach your entry level English courses. That's English 101 and 102. And that's pretty much always going to be a composition course. Usually English 101 is like an intro to composition. If you're lucky, the college will teach it through the lens of rhetoric, hopefully classical rhetoric, although some people teach rhetoric and they don't use the classical rhetorical terms like ethos, logos, pathos. They just look at like audience, style, and tone, which are rhetorical themes, but it's not really classical rhetoric. And then in English 102, usually what you'll do is I've been at a few schools where they actually it has like a literature component in it. So it's sort of like a survey course, and like you'll do poetry, drama, novels, narrative, and sort of like an intro to lit analysis. But most places usually take your skills you got in composition 1, which typically you give like assigned topics, and then so you kind of narrowly define what the students are writing about. And then in the second level course, English 102, typically it's like sort of like take those skills and now it's open-ended. You're going to pick your topics, you're going to find your sources. And so you emphasize the research methods component, right? And using the argumentative skills to do that. So that's sort of how I got into the realm of teaching English. I think did you also ask me how I got to write the book as well?
Yep. Yeah. Sorry, I gave you a big question.
It's okay. I know it was a long-winded answer for the first part, probably. How did that start? I never really planned to write about education because I figured, try to keep a little buffer between my place of employment and my political opinion, right?
It seemed prudent sometimes.
It's probably a safer bet. There was a point in it wasn't maybe a year or two before Trump got elected. We had a governor in Illinois, Bruce Rauner, and he was stalling on the budget and basically wouldn't pass it. And I saw this as a ploy to privatize public services, and in particular education, because if you don't pass the state budget, you can't get any. Obviously, the state funds don't go out, but you also cannot receive federal funds. And so one of the departments where I worked was actually I was teaching some GED stuff at that time, so it was like adult ed, and the whole thing because the adult ed department was basic. I think it was like 90% federally funded, but without the federal funds being released, right, it basically shut down. And basically what this opened the door for was to put these types of public institutions into private receivership. I recognized that Bruce Rauner, he was a big proponent of school choice, which is a euphemism for public-private partnerships, in other words, charter schools, but also voucher programs and things like education savings accounts and tax credits for tuition and things like that. What they all have in common is you're funneling public dollars into either a public-private charter corporation, or you're just taking the public dollars and you're funneling them into a private school. And he also floated a lot of other buzzwords that I'd heard. Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt, who wrote the foreword to my book, she talked about, so obviously school choice was one of those things. She worked in the Department of Education under Ronald Reagan, blew the whistle on something called Project Best. So all the things that she had talked about, he was sort of, he was dog whistling. So again, we had school choice. The other one was, the phrase is cradle to career education. So that's basically replacing academics with workforce training. This was also during a time of the rise of what's called P20 councils. So when I was, we went to a couple of conferences, education conferences, and they were promoting these P20 councils. And they have them in several states, most states. But in Illinois, I remember one of the things that they were talking about at this conference was like, sort of polling the crowd, like, well, what sorts of public-private partnerships would be best for these P20 councils, which is what they are. They're basically clearinghouses for public-private partnerships. And, people are like, oh, well, like the healthcare and like mental health and like, oh, criminal justice, right? And so like synthesizing through public-private partnerships, education, not only with workforce training, but with like crime prevention and healthcare. And I was also at that time, I was working for a company, did some online tutoring, and I noticed that this company, they announced that they were going to have IBM's Watson co-pilot with us. So IBM's Watson is this AI bot. It can do everything from like finance, security threat assessments. It can do healthcare, and it can do education. And so basically what I saw was, so what they were telling me is that every day I go to work, Watson's going to data mine what I do, and it's going to come up with some algorithms to replace at least part of what I do. I would imagine eventually the goal is to make it so that it can automate everything I do. And this was another thing that Charlotte talked about, which was basically back then they were known as teaching machines, right? So this is 81 that she blew the whistle on Project Best, right? I mean, most households don't have computers in them at this point, but basically moving toward the digital era, they wanted to use operant conditioning, which is B.F. Skinner's method of psychological conditioning. And they wanted to use it through computers to condition the students for the workforce training so that they could funnel them into the public-private planned economy. And so basically all those things that I've heard her talk about in her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, all those things happened. They sort of took my my job away at the time. So I figured, well, it's basically say something now or forever hold your peace. I mean, they can't take the job away from me twice right there. And it's like, so I wrote an article, and she found the article and reached out to me, she being Charlotte. And, at first I'm thinking like, this is like gotta be some kind of scam or a bot or, something is virus attached to it. But it was her. And, she said, great job and, keep up the good work. And so I, sort of I focused largely on the school choice element in that article. So the next one, I wrote the next article on the workforce training, and the next one was on the P20. So I sort of wrote a series of articles, and then I asked her, would she help me with a book? She was busy, was going through a lot of stuff, but she said, any of my stuff you want to use, you can use it. And she did put me in touch with Chris Milligan at Trying Day Books to get the contract. And just a little bit of interesting background for people who don't know. Trying Day is also that's who republished Anthony Sutton's America's Secret Establishment, Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones. Anthony Sutton wrote that book based on the Black Address books, the catalogs that were leaked by Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt. Her dad and her grandfather were both members of the Order of Skull and Bones. And actually, I have those physical address books at this point. You can get them on my website, on my database. And one of the first chapters in that book is called How the Order Controls Education. So my book is also it's basically a synthesis of Charlotte's research and Sutton's research, and it's published by the same people that published Sutton's work as well. So that's sort of the history of how I came to publish School World Order.
That's very cool. That was a great story.
It's a neat story. I like to tell it.
Yeah. Well, it's also really, what an honor to, take an interest in someone's work and then to have them, be reciprocal and appreciate your efforts and want to collaborate. So yeah, that's really awesome. When you talk about school choice, that resonates very much for me because when I was in 6th grade, I actually started a board for school choice. And yeah, I was definitely involved, or at least like I thought I was politically minded, I guess, from a pretty young age. But it's so interesting looking back because, it does really illustrate just how these dialectical games are played because I thought that was such a win. And I think about 6 years later, it actually got implemented. I lived in a town it was a very small town that was adjacent to a slightly bigger town. And there was no high school in my actual town. So most of them went to the neighboring public school, but that school was very cliche. The neighboring town had literal railroad tracks in the middle, and there was the good side of the tracks and the less safe side of the tracks. And so so the education at that school was not very good, and you didn't really have a choice unless you wanted to go to private school. And I didn't think that was fair. So I thought, well, we need to do something about this. I should be able to. I had gone to nursery school with friends who were in a town that was just as close. It was also next door, but it was a much better high school. And so I wanted to, this was just, selfish and naive. I was like, well, why can't I go to high school with them? And that was why I started the board. And about 6 years later, they did actually, I don't know if I had anything to do with it. I'd like to think I did, but it did get put into place. But I now realize that it's kind of a Trojan horse. It's not really, what I think, well, certainly, or at least what I thought it was when I was in 6th grade.
Well, so some of the, the issues with the charter schools and the vouchers is that most of the time, right, if you want to get out of the public system, right, you usually want to get away from the federal or state curriculum and everything that comes along with that.
Right.
Problem with funneling the federal or state dollars into the private schools is now you have those strings attached. And in the early phases, right, they want to sort of, because, the government is in bed with the corporations, right? And so they want to sort of facilitate ultimately this privately controlled, publicly funded, centralized system. So early on, not a lot of strings came attached with some of those vouchers and some of those, right? Sure. There's a little more flexibility, but over time, what happens is that along with it comes all the stuff you were trying to get away from. And at this point, right, there's really no way out because in the charter schools in particular, you don't have an elected board. And, I know that, right, a lot of the elected boards, right, they just sort of are mouthpieces for, the Department of Ed and whether state or federal. But it's better to at least be able to vote those people out and to voice some sort of recourse. Sure. Potentially, have some ability to change the curriculum through that democratic process, as opposed to a corporate board where basically what they say is, you don't like it, go to a different school, basically, right? And
Right.
so the idea, in theory, John Gatto, actually, if you read the Underground History of American Education, his ending section chapter is basically, he's got some solutions, okay? And he doesn't really call them charter schools in there, but I mean, that's the idea if you read it, right? He's basically saying decentralized, basically autonomous or relatively privately operated schools, and that you could subsidize them through, various local, state, federal tax dollars and things like that. And I like John Gatto. I cite him in my book, but I think at the time, I don't think people necessarily look far enough down the tracks. But that was one of the things where Charlotte, one of the reasons why, I admired her so much was she didn't do the whole left-right thing, right? She did the right-wrong thing, right? And it came down to, she was largely, she was a Catholic and conservative and, all that type of stuff. If you wanted to, put her on one side.
Put her in a box, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but when it came to stuff like that, a lot of people on the right or the conservative end did not like that. You know what I mean? And so she wasn't always popular for the principles she held. But yeah, those are the things that I would say about charter schools, and you kind of, and at another level, it's like, it looks like a good solution because first you have compulsory ed. Right. And you have federally funded ed, which is largely what she focused on in the deliberate dumbing down of America, right? She saw that the federal funding basically bloated the budgets and the curriculums, and then you give all these administrators, and that builds in these public-private partnerships and other sorts of curriculums that don't really have anything to do with academics or the classical method. And eventually what happened was, I gave the example of my adult ed department. Well, now you become reliant on the federal dollar. Well, once you take that out, what are you going to do, right? Now we can funnel you into the corporate system. And when she blew the whistle on Project Best in 1981, some of the she was at the Office of Educational Research and Improvement, and they had sort of moved her around to different sub departments, and one of them was, this is 81, school choice. Another one was public-private partnerships. Another one was technology, right? And so what I'm saying is that, school choice, charter schools, that really comes out of, he was the president of the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, for a while, Albert Shanker, okay? And so this came out of the concept came out of a union boss, and I want to say 84, 86. It's mid 80s. It's after she blew the whistle on Project Best. Okay. And the first charter school bill, I want to say, was Clinton. And this is the 90s. All right. So what I'm getting at here is that, right, almost 15-ish years, let's say roughly, before charter schools is a term, right, they had the idea of school choice, public-private partnerships. So I look at these things sort of in iterations and waves as sort of culminating towards this, what is now this, stakeholder capitalist model of globalism. And that was sort of the steps to get us there. First, you make education compulsory, then you federalize it, then you force them into the companies, you merge the Fed with the corporation, and then you merge that with the global apparatus that is, we see now through WEF and Great Reset and all that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to explain it. And that definitely, it looks like those seem to be the stages for sure. We definitely see, I think if anybody doesn't understand a great analogy would be just to look at medicine for the past 2 years. So much of the guys of pushing things through was because they were getting federal funding, right? That was where that was the justification for why the healthcare workers were not exempt from getting the injections, is because the hospitals were getting federal funding.
Yeah. And then with the CARES Act, all that money that went to the schools was largely used for 3 categories. Okay. And as an adjunct, I managed to weasel my way to be the adjunct representative on the CARES committee, which, wasn't fun for either of us, I don't think, it's to the extent that, I was one of the few people that sort of let's just say I raised lots of questions. Okay. But there was basically three there, and none of those questions were received in a way where, they sort of just kind of went in ear and out the other. But
unfortunately,
so there was like PPE. So a lot of the money was for like, masks and sanitizer and maybe, those little things they use, take your temperature, all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
But most of it was for to facilitate distance learning, right? Or online. Okay.
Right.
So,
Sure.
whether it be, you needed more broadband, you needed to, applications, apps to go on the learning management systems, Zoom or Google Meets, contracts or whatever. Most of that money was funneled from the Fed through the school into, Google, Microsoft, et cetera, and a bunch of other technologies that we'll probably talk about at some point.
Yes.
During this interview. So again, right? I mean, that's again the whole merger of the federal and the corporate.
Right. Well, let's go backwards before we get to that. Let's start with how did we get to the federal kind of compulsory kind of education?
So that basically starts. This is sort of where the order. You kind of start with the order of Skull and Bones. So the main bonesman that influenced the rise of compulsory public education in the United States would have been Alphonso Taft, and he's actually the co-founder of the Order of Skull and Bones. It was him and William Huntington Russell. And William Huntington Russell, if you ever wanted to go to Yale and you wanted to go to the archive, and they do have some stuff on the Order. You don't ask for, we want to see the archives on the Order of Skull and Bones. You say you want to see, and you don't say Russell Trust Association either, which is the corporate name for the charter for the fraternity. You say RTA Corporation, which is Russell Trust Association. Okay. Right. And so anyways, it's named after William Huntington Russell, who founded it with Alphonso Taft. And Alphonso Taft was at Antioch College, and it was at Antioch College where he basically promoted Horace Mann, and it was Horace Mann that founded the idea of compulsory public schooling. Okay, and that was largely the idea, that system was largely modeled after the Prussian model that came. Sort of was inspired by Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and it sort of came out of after they had their battles with Napoleon. To sort of sum it up, Fichte and others felt that the reason why they lost was because the soldiers had not been inculcated with enough reflexive obedience, meaning, right, they should have just rushed forward onto the bayonets, right? So what he felt was he needed an educational system that largely trained people to be obedient to authority. Okay. And ultimately, it was a lot of people don't know, it's really Fichte who comes up with the idea of what Hegel called the dialectic, right? And it's who? Fichte, Johann Gottlieb Fichte.
Okay.
He's the one that basically conceived of the idea. It's Hegel who takes it and basically makes it the core of his philosophy and popularizes it. And Hegelianism was heavily promoted by the Order of Skull and Bones. Many of them were Hegelians, and three in particular in the early phases of the rise of what became the university system in the United States would have been Daniel Coit Gilman, okay, and then Andrew Dixon White and Timothy Dwight, and Sutton refers to these three as the Troika, and so they were responsible for setting up some of the most prominent universities in the country. So Johns Hopkins University, Cornell University, University of California, Berkeley. Believe one or more of them was also important in terms of how instrumental in setting up the land grant systems for colleges, where they would get like basically big plots of land to either build campuses or in the like ag tech types of research. But all those guys were Hegelian, and so they, in founding these universities, they imported Hegelian ideas, not just dialectical ideas, but his whole idea of the collectivist idea of the state sort of being the manifestation of the synthesis of whatever ideas.
The God, essentially, yeah.
Yeah, right. He said it was God marching on. Right.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's sort of the early phases of. You start with Taft, Alfonso Taft. He gets Horace Mann to set up this compulsory system, and then you have these three other bonesmen that sort of build the university system on top of it.
Wow. So you said it was Victa who really created the dialectic. You wouldn't say that the dialectic would have started with Plato?
Well, I just mean in terms of, you could go back further.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
In terms of, and I'm not familiar with what would be Plato's.
The allegory of the cave, the intelligible realm, the unintelligible realm, the dividing line. I think essentially
So just his idea, his general concept of dualism, or the dualism.
Yeah, the dualism, and and then the dividing line. It is essentially kind of the negation, right? Because that's the.
Okay.
I know that thesis, antithesis, synthesis actually came from Kant, and then Plato said, Hegel said the abstract, the concrete, negative, abstract. Which were similar, but not quite the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and so I guess I meant more like the modern iteration, right? It really, because Hegel was very much influenced by, right? Coming out of the German idealist school and whatnot. So
yeah, and I'm not as familiar with him. So yeah.
Yeah, I've got a few of his pieces over here. So this is the one, addresses to the German nation. That's the piece in which he basically lays out his philosophy of what becomes the Prussian model of education. And according to Sutton, he was closely connected to the Bavarian Illuminati, right? And
doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. So there's that connection as well, and there's other interesting connections to the Bavarian Illuminati and Skull and Bones. Like just one in particular, was the order imported Wundtian stimulus response psychology, and it was so Wilhelm Wundt's either his father or his grandfather. Let's say his grandfather, Karl Casimir Wundt, was in the Bavarian Illuminati, right? And we can trace that, I think, largely through what is this here? John Robeson's Proofs of Conspiracy, and the other one was Augustin Baruel, I believe is how you pronounce it.
Code of the Illuminati.
Yeah, right. So so that's where we sort of have, how do we know these people had their little code names in the Illuminati? Those are the texts that Sutton references in there.
Right. Yeah, no, those are great. But I haven't read Code of the Illuminati yet, but I have read Proofs of Conspiracy, and it's pretty wild. It's really detailed.
I have an original copy.
You have it. So I just have to share this with the audience. So we were talking before I press record, and he's got this amazing library. I'm so jealous. He's got all these original texts. And I know my audience has heard me talk about Dr. John Coleman's book, The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. And what is it? Shaping the Decline of the Moral, Social. You have it. So this book on Amazon is $5,000, but he has an original copy.
Right. There it is.
Sorry, little interjection here. Yeah.
Yeah, shaping the moral, spiritual, cultural, political, and economic decline in the United States. Yeah. But that's one of the neat little things that she gave me.
Very awesome. So you have the original copy of Proofs of Conspiracy, which was first published in 1798. So it was Code of the Illuminati. They were also. So when people tell me like it's conspiracy texts, I'm like, these were from the guys back then, over 2 centuries ago.
She put sticky notes in it, so I don't know, but it's all right. I got, it's just cool to look at it and say, like, this is the original. It's not a, it's got the old, the old thorns and ashes, as far as the old English alphabet or Middle English.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. How cool. All right. Well, anyway. So, okay. So we think that which that makes sense because so what were their goals? Their goals were to, as you said, it was for compliance and obedience. And didn't Dewey, and you have a section on Dewey in your book as well, didn't he say the same thing? Wasn't he pretty transparent about?
He was very much a Hegelian, right? He's very much a Hegelian, and he studied under G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall was he was given his position at Johns Hopkins University by Daniel Craig Gilman, and it was G. Stanley Hall who set up the first department of psychology in the United States. Before that, they were subdivisions of philosophy. And G. Stanley Hall, the reason why Daniel Craig Gilman promoted him or hired him for that position in particular was because he was the first American PhD under Wilhelm Wundt. He was the first American to earn a PhD from Wilhelm Wundt. He went over there and studied under him which was the world's first psychology laboratory. So he was the first person to do, laboratory experiments in the discipline of psychology. And so Dewey basically comes out of that tradition. And I should say that Hall was also a Hegelian. He was strongly a Hegelian as well. So in Hall and in Dewey, what you have is a synthesis of, right, Hegelianism and also the idea of stimulus response psychology. Now, Dewey is not like the hardcore behaviorist, or what would be later referred to as behaviorism, like some of the later folk, like one of his students, John B. Watson. John B. Watson is this guy who, he's coined the term behaviorism. Okay. And he's also an advertiser and things like that. He did this thing called the Little Albert experiment, where he wanted to see, could they condition this little baby to be scared of white rabbits. And so every time they brought the rabbit out, they would bang this hammer or clang a cymbal or something like that, and he would become frightened, and he would associate the fear with the rabbit. And so eventually, right, if you brought out any rabbit or eventually anything that was white and furry, or even just a human with a rabbit mask on, he would freak out, right? He would be been conditioned to respond to that stimuli in that way. So somebody like John B. Watson, there's this quote by him. He says something like, I'm going to paraphrase, but it's like, give me a homeless guy and let me schedule his daily routines, micromanage everything he does, and I'll turn him into a lawyer in, however long it takes, whatever, a couple months or a year, whatever his time period he said, right? So for him, like, all cognition, all learning they're just nervous system responses to environmental stimuli. Like, that's their entire view of cognition, or, what others might refer to as the soul, right? Psychology actually means the soul. Right. And I think it's over there. Yeah. B.F. Skinner, he wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, right? And you can kind of infer what he's getting at there, right? Is that freedom and dignity, these things, these concepts rest on the a priori assumption that there is a mind in here that has a will and a consciousness, or a soul, right? And it has the ability to choose how it reacts to stimuli. And within that realm, or that possibility of choosing how to respond or whether to respond to stimuli, is dignity, okay? But if everything is just a mechanism, right? If you just mechanistically respond to stuff, freedom and dignity are like, they're not just abstractions, but they're basically like superstitions, right? They're like the ether or something like that. Okay, so Dewey is not, he's not quite that hardcore. He comes up with something called functional psychology. So basically, he made it a little more humanistic. In that, that's sort of what Abraham Maslow would later. He sort of coins that term, humanistic psychology, right? Positive psychology, because all of the behaviorists and even a lot of the psychoanalysts and the Freudians, right? Whether you were looking at the subconscious mind or nervous system responses to stimuli, largely what those two schools of psychology focused on were like pathologies. right?
Right.
And so it was like trying to correct all these different pathologies. And for someone like Maslow in his positive psychology, he called this process of self-actualization, right? Like if all you're doing is pointing out these things that needs to be fixed, like, right, you're sort of on a negative recursive sort of dialectic, right? And so there you can't actually ever get out of that process of right negative analysis. So
Right.
for him, you had to find something
The critique, as Marx would call it. Yeah.
And so he eventually gets into like, new age stuff, but so Dewey, is sort of in between there. Right. But yeah, he's definitely a Hegelian. And he was one of the founding members of the AFT as well, the American Federation of Teachers as well. So
wow. Wow. And so what was his role? So he was one of the founding members of the AFT, and then wasn't he one of the founders of public education?
Reading it by founders of public education. You mean like
wasn't it his ideas that really kind of moved things into a public versus like?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, so his in terms of his pedagogy, right? I mean, like, if you go and you get a degree in education, yes, you're going to study a lot of Dewey, right? And so he was also, so he was at his ideas sort of were promulgated out of two universities. So one University of Chicago, the other one Columbia University, and I think he didn't found it. He became the head of it. I believe he founded the Lincoln School at Teachers College. Okay, and in Columbia University.
Yeah.
In both of these places, he received Rockefeller funding from different Rockefeller sources. If you've ever bothered to look at all their various philanthropies, there's tons of them. But the most prominent would have been the General Education Board. That was actually their first philanthropy that they set up. There's an interesting, nice little, neat little book. Is it up there? There it is. I don't know if you can read it. It says the Leipzig Connection. Okay, Paulo Leone. I mean, like you could read it in like an hour and a half, especially if you're an athlete. It's really small. It's almost like a pamphlet, but he breaks down the robber baron funding of not just Dewey, but all the various behaviorists. He goes and looks at E.L. Thorndike, who was also at Columbia University. And it was Thorndike. Thorndike was actually hired by this guy named James McKean Cattell. And James McKean Cattell, he also earned his PhD from Wilhelm Wundt. Okay. And but the interesting thing about him was he was a big fan of Galton. So he wanted to combine, right, this idea of the stimulus response classical conditioning method of psychology with Galton's ideas about, genetics, right? About biological determinants. Okay. And so he basically wanted to condition people based on, their biological, predispositions. Okay. But he hires Thorndike and he really focuses on what was called the puzzle box experiment. So he kind of moves stimulus response psychology forward into the age of behaviorism. And he's one of these guys that popularized how to schedule punishments and rewards more efficiently. And, he's one of these guys that pioneered, the rat in the maze with the pigeon and the button. And it's from those puzzle box experiments that B.F. Skinner at Harvard would later come up with something called, he's at Indiana University first, but then he was at Harvard. And he called them the Skinner box experiments. And he did basically the same thing, except he basically added two quadrants, right? So you had punishment and reward, but he added a positive and a negative to each, right? And the positive and negative just means, are you adding a stimulus or are you removing it? Right. And so, the punishment is going to make you averse to something. Reward is going to make you move towards something or make you attracted to it. And the way that you make the person averse or attracted has to do with, taking away stimulus or adding. So punishment, think about like you could either ground a kid or you might spank the kid, right? One is the grounding is you remove the freedom of movement. That's the negative, and then the spank would be the positive. That's fine. That would be positive because you're adding the painful stimulus, but to use his terminology, that's what it means. Oh, anyways. So yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So, and around what time period, I guess, was all of this?
Okay, so let's
Sorry.
see. No.
Just to give people the context of, the timeline.
So I'm going to say that compulsory ed. Okay, so the order, so the horseman, the order 1832ish, something like that is when they chartered or when they first set it up. The actual charter, RTA Corporation charter, comes a little bit later, but like first chapter, right? There's 15 members every year. It's a senior society. The first 15 are like 1832 or 33. I think it's 32 because I think it matches up with the 322 number.
Right.
It's not that long after that Alfonso Taft promotes horseman at Antioch College. And then I would say that the university system being set up, I want to say that that's post-Civil War-ish. And that when we're talking about the modern stimulus response method and it getting all this funding, we're talking early 1900s. Right. So that's, as far as Thorndike and Dewey getting that money.
Right.
I could be off by maybe a decade.
Sure.
But that's roughly
the general timeline. Sure. And that sounds pretty right based on the players involved. That sounds. So then where do we go next?
Where do we go next? Historically?
Yeah. I think that's a good way to break it down for people to understand, because I think you said it that was a really good way to contextualize it, that it starts with kind of federalizing it, the compulsory, the federal, then corporate, and now we move into more of like the technocratic kind of, right?
Yeah. I kind of, it's funny you asked that. I mean, like, because I wrote the book more thematically than historically.
Yeah.
Right. And so like the way I've organized my ability to be articulate has been largely
by all means, don't let me take that away from you. You can structure it however is comfortable.
It's a good question though.
Sorry.
No.
You did structure it thematically, and I do really like it thematically. I'm just thinking in terms of the timeline, it's kind of interesting to see, how things evolve.
Yeah, I guess the next. Yeah, no. So I'm thinking about where. So the next phase would be the beginning of federal funding of education, right? Large amounts of funding into. So the Department of Education is 1979 was when it was created. Right? Not very old at all. Okay?
No.
Now before that.
The 70s were like ruthless in terms of advancing this whole like UN globalist agenda. It's crazy.
Yeah, we all talked a lot about that at the AFA conference, because I mean, a lot of us had done our own research, but then everybody would present like that's that year, 72, especially 71, 72. Those were very pivotal, right?
World Economic Forum, the European Symposium Management,
and
Club of Rome.
Club Rome is 68, but that's the year that they do limits to growth.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it was super pivotal. So the next phase would be like the federal part, right? And so, like I said, before the Department of Education was its own thing, there was HEW, right? It was the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. All right. So they basically had all that under one department. Okay. And then what they did was when they created the Department of Education, basically what they did was they broke that up and basically made each of those sections its own department. And so out of that new bill didn't just come the Department of Education, you also got the Department of Health and Human Services. Okay. And I'm not sure if the Department of Labor comes out of that switch, but I know that those first two do, because I've mapped it. I've got a brain database where I've taken the time to sort of map all this out.
Cool.
So
I just learned of that database. It's awesome.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it's fun. It's fun to play with, and it helps. Because you got all these names, who, what, where, when, and sometimes it's like. You want to just go back and remember real quick, and you just kind of click it up. I'm like, oh yeah, and then it helps. I'm a visual learner, so it helps kind of put things in flow charts. I like flow charts. I'm kind of a nerd.
Yeah.
But so especially with the Department of Education, right? We get sort of the rise of federal funding into education. And this is around the time, again, so when Reagan got hired, when he got elected, he ran on this idea that he was going to abolish the Department of Education.
I think Carol Quigley might argue hired, but yeah.
Oh yeah, and he didn't do that, right? So I mean, Charlotte was a big Reagan fan in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
She actually had a lot of friends out in California who were familiar with him as governor. This is a time when they called him Red Ronnie, and they were telling her like, this guy's not what you think. I mean, you don't want to hitch your wagon to this guy.
Wow.
And there's a book called "Here's the Rest of Him," and I've got it. It's in the other room. It's largely a breakdown of his dealings as governor. And I've got a lot of old files of stuff that he did while he was governor as well. But she quickly found out and said that she quickly realized that her friends were correct as far as what he was all about. And it wasn't just a lot of the stuff that I named you might think of as sort of like corporatists, or you might think of it as right wing or fascist, right? And public-private partnership. She even tells a story, or used to tell a story, where she was at one of these meetings on public-private partnerships, and she asks them. She says, "Isn't this kind of like corporate fascism?" And she says, "They go, well, gee, Charlotte, we never thought of it like that." Was kind of the response that they gave her. But he also promoted a lot of in the department. It wasn't just the public-private partnerships and the ed tech and the partnerships with the early on with the computer technology corporations. There was a lot of stuff like values clarification and things like that. Like Sidney Simon's values clarification. This is basically sort of a precursor or a predecessor to critical theory and all the woke identity politics that are in school now, right? I mean, So the idea was, again, you can just sort of think of the two terms, values clarification, critical theory, and in each one, right? To clarify your values, you have to critique your assumptions about the things you value. That was sort of the basis of it. And they'd have things like, there's this, like, I've got it somewhere, the old worksheets that were called All About Me. And they'd give the kids like a little stick figure, and they'd have these little bubbles to fill in, like, what your preferences, what goes on at home, what does mom and dad do for a living, what types of food do you eat, so you can get like you can get into what the home life is like, what the culture is like, what the political and religious beliefs are, and then you sort of move them through a process of questioning it. So I say all that to say that he was Charlotte would have said and did say it. She said that she thought he was a communist. And she said it outright. I would say, I used to always say stuff like, well, is he a communist, or, was Gorbachev a corporatist? Because Gorbachev, they signed these educational agreements. This is one of the big things that she had a lot to say about. Okay. And, whenever I say that to people, she said Reagan was a communist. Not a lot of people think that. It doesn't matter which end of the spectrum you're on either, right? If you're like on the right end, you're kind of like, oh, no. Reagan's kind of like has this mythos for conservatives, right?
Right.
And, on the left, it's just, there's no way that guy was a communist, right? But it was funny when Gorbachev died not too long ago.
Mm-hmm.
I watched, Fox News, Newsmax, right? All the right-wing, news media. And they had nothing but wonderful things to say about the guy. And so it was just interesting. I mean, like, I couldn't help but think about Charlotte. Like, right? Like, why is the conservative media so,
Didn't he?
Yeah.
Sorry, didn't... Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point. And didn't he create like a National Education Day or something like that? There was something that he created, and I think that's what it was. And it was mostly because like they knew that they couldn't do it like through like a bill or like something that was legislated. It had to be done as kind of like essentially an NGO, right? And it had to be done under the guise of it being kind of like this philanthropic type of, and I think that's it. I thought, yeah, NED. I think that's what it was.
He had that foundation that I believe
Yeah.
out there in Presidio. Now I'm not familiar with the programs that came out. It would not surprise me at all if he had some sort of an education.
I'll have to look it up. I could be wrong on that, but it was something to that effect. And I definitely think, like, wasn't he also he had some kind of a role, maybe just as an actor, but with the GM.
Oh, you're talking about Reagan. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm talking about Reagan. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And they said that, I watched this documentary on him, and supposedly the reason why they liked him, they wanted to push him for president, was he also used to announce these sports games. And there was one where he was announcing a baseball game, and this was over the radio, so no one could see. And there was they lost connection, right? Where they knew that they couldn't see the game, right? But they were still on air. And so Reagan keeps going, foul ball. He keeps pretending like this guy's hitting foul balls instead of saying technical difficulties. And he did such a good job because nobody had a clue that it was no connect. And they were like, this is our guy for president, right? So, just think about that in terms of, being able to sort of put the curtain up a little bit. But Gorbachev, just as a side note, because we just mentioned, right? Rome. So, he also was a member of the Club of Rome. And in 92, he helped set up Earth Charter in a collaboration with Maurice Strong. Maurice Strong was the guy who, not only was he on the foundation board for the World Economic Forum, he also he's the one that set up the UNEP in 1972, which is the exact same year the Club of Rome published Limits to Growth. 92, not only the same year that Strong sets up the Rio Conference, which you get Agenda 21, which becomes SDGs. 92 is the same year that this sequel to Limits to Growth is published, and it was actually, what is it?
Global Reformation.
Yeah, and Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, Bilderberg, was the one that put Strong and Gorbachev together. So again, you have Gorbachev, and I know that he, in many ways, I guess he was sort of the reformer of the Soviet Union. So you can't put him in the same basket as like a hardcore communist, I guess. But that's why I said, so was Reagan a communist or was he a corporatist? There might be semantic, but the idea here is that the two, right, were working together, and that Gorbachev was also friendly with a lot of other globalists that were part of the what quickly called the round table structure. So.
Totally. Well, I think, and certainly in Sutton's book, he would talk about this. I think the interesting point that you're bringing up is that whether or not he's the corporatist or a communist, ultimately is advancing the same goals. And that's really, so, I do know, as a total side note, or I should say I've heard that he was also knighted by the crown, which I think is interesting.
Gorbachev or Reagan?
Reagan.
Okay, yeah, I wouldn't doubt that. I mean, they had a lot of conservative media had a lot of praise to give at the passing of the Queen as well. So a lot of praise going around for both of those. But yeah, what that shows is, this gets us back to the whole dialectic, right? This whole alien movement of history, right? The synthesis of these opposites into this greater, eventually this, global utopia, new age, new world order, whatever you want. And Gorbachev was a big new ager. He was buddies. He was had some connections to the Esalen Institute, and Barbara Marx Hubbard. I believe she met with him, but if she didn't, I know she was over there during that phase when he was doing all this stuff. And she was this big new age guru. So there's another one. There's Educators for Social Responsibility. ESR, it's called something else. And now it still exists, but back in the 80s, Charlotte had a big file on Educators for Social Responsibility, and their whole thing was about Soviet American exchange agreements and sort of collaborations. And this is in the wake of those Soviet American education agreements that Reagan and Gorbachev signed. So,
wow, and I feel like I don't know if we illustrated this, but I think in some ways that what your point was that the school choice was part of this dialectic, right? I just wanted to carry it
That's
through.
that's good. That's good because I mean, so okay, think same era, same concept. Think Schwab's stakeholder capital.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, what is it largely? What does it mean to have a stakeholder capitalism? Well, that means that it's not shareholder capitalism, which means it's not just the the corporate board and Wall Street and the CEOs and people and then the shareholders that are invested in it. It also means, right, some of these public agencies or community oriented organizations that are going to be affected or impacted by it. So for him, right, you take the traditional shareholders and then you put them all together with these other stakeholders, which are either going to be representing in the instance of education. So the corporate shareholders are going to be your Microsoft, your Google, your IBM that are facilitating the technology. Your public stakeholders are going to be the school itself, the Department of Ed, right? The local district, the teachers, maybe the unions, and then the families, and hopefully the families and the children and students that go to the schools, and that is basically what he would call stakeholder capitalism. But another way we could just look at that as it's public-private partnerships, right? And so school choice, he comes up with that concept. Well, he pitches it to the World Economic Forum in 1973. He does it at a meeting where, which is the same WEF meeting when Aurelio Pecci, founder of the Club of Rome, pitches limits to growth to the WEF. And one of the honorary sponsor for that conference was Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who was Nazi SS and the founder or co-founder of the Bilderberg Group. Okay, but so you're talking, what is that? It's not even 10 years before the Department of Ed has this sub-department on public-private partnerships. And, one of the things that I discovered from the file she gave me was, so I mentioned today Project BEST, Basic Education Skills Through Technology. And basically what it was a program to put it all together, right? So basically you're going to replace academics with workforce training through public-private partnerships with education technology companies that would facilitate psychological conditioning through these operant conditioning algorithms, which become today the modern adaptive learning courseware. Okay. But that was basically our domestic version of something that was called UNESCO Study 11. And UNESCO Study 11, I wrote a long piece about it at Unlimited Hangout, and the link is on my website, but you can go to Unlimited Hangout and get it. And basically what was going on there was, so they had a regional partnership between, Western capitalist nations of the United States and Europe, in partnership or collaboration with several Eastern Bloc Soviet and communist nations. And they also so I've got several of the white papers from all the various nation states, and then I've got sort of the overarching synthesis papers of sort of how they came together with what they piloted in their various nation states. But in each of those documents, you see that involved in this are multinational technology corporations like Microsoft, Apple, and IBM in particular. But it built on an earlier document from 1977, and the title of it escapes me, but it focused largely on ed tech in the Eastern Bloc Soviet and communist nations. And basically what they said was the centralized statecraft of the Eastern Bloc communist and socialist nations was ideal for implementing ed tech through various ministries or departments of education, because you could centralize it and you can engineer the learning outcomes more efficiently. But in order to globalize it, to get it, make a global system that is now, what we're seeing sort of to set up the infrastructure for this thing called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, what you needed was the multinational technology corporations who could basically operate across those various borders. So basically, the whole project was to get that ed tech sort of in place, right? Sort of make computers commonplace, ubiquitous, eventually plug in the ed tech. And then now that we're in this new phase, this new era of the Great Reset and the 4IR, now you take the centralized statecraft and you sort of implement it on a global scale through these global public-private partnerships facilitated by things like UNESCO, the WEF, and World Bank, IMF, etc.
It's really horrifying. So
so that's your synthesis of your public and private on a global scale at a Hegelian manifestation.
For sure. So before we get into, I do want to dive into some of the the technological horrors that are being implemented in schools. But before we dive into that, I want to cover some of the ideological background that I think are, lead us here. Like, what were some of their goals in setting? I think, some of it as obviously has been usurped, and it was an opportunity that was seized, and I think some of it was groundworks that was laid from a very early stage, right? So I think if we look back through what some of the goals were initially, and then some of the just ideology, like the eugenics movements, the Malthusians, the and certainly like the Bilderberg, the Illuminati, their goals of the one world government. I mean, they talk about it back then. So, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine education was a large part of achieving those goals.
Oh yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of moving parts there, right?
Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, okay. So you touched on. I mean, ultimately, what we're talking about is social engineering.
Right.
Okay? I mean, in the end game here, now we see something called transhumanism. Yeah. Right. And so you could look at it in terms of social engineering on two levels. And one is to engineer the individual human being, and the other is to engineer the collective, in other words, the society, in other words, the state.
Sure.
Okay. And so on the individual scale, you're talking about a synthesis of all the different methods of psychological conditioning that we talked about, which basically boils all cognition and consciousness down to reflexes to environmental stimuli. But then the other one that you touched on that I sort of hinted at earlier is the eugenics, right? So this is basically the engineering of biology, the biological engineering, basically what Galton referred to as effectively steering evolution, right? So his cousin was Charles Darwin, right? And he basically, says, takes this idea of natural selection and says that we can speed this up through two things called positive eugenics and negative. That's where I was like, where'd the N come from? Negative. I've been saying negative eugenics, positive eugenics, right? I guess I didn't need the air quotes for the negative part. But basically what positive was his idea that so the elites should inbreed. Okay. And so, basically get the fit gene pools to, proliferate and to keep down what he called the unfit, right? Or like the useless eaters. And you prevent them from breeding through, what eventually becomes like methods of compulsory sterilization, abortion, euthanasia. Okay. And those culminate ultimately in, the Nazi Holocaust and concentration camps. And, there's a good book on that called, there's two of them really, War Against the Weak by Edwin Black, and then IBM and the Holocaust by Edwin Black as well. And so those were considered two different schools. All right. Like in the realm of academia, you sort of thought of one as, so psychology was like the science of nurture, and biology or eugenics was like the science of nature. And it was, you always talked about it like nature versus nurture. But interestingly, right, if you ever look at even someone like Skinner, right, like he does not deny that there's no biological basis to stuff, right? And so in his technology of teaching, he had designed certain teaching machines for people that, I guess today we would say are like on the spectrum, okay? And he thought that those machines, right, they had to be very narrow in what they could condition those people to do, because he felt that, right, biologically they were sort of capped. So the whole nature versus nurture was it's always kind of discussed that way, but there was always some sort of overlap. And actually, if you read Brave New World, the first chapter He's basically setting the plot and the setting, right? He's just sort of setting what I call world building in the world of, in a novel. And it's all about, it's basically the eugenics, right? It's how do they biologically engineer these different castes for workforce purposes? Okay. And he, elaborates on, they put them in these test tubes and they go in the factory conveyor belt and they are blasted with these, different, put alcohol in the bloodstream if you want them to be a lower IQ and, do other things. If you want them to work in the heat, you'd heat up the vials and things like that. But then the second chapter is all about, they're in the neo-Pavlovian conditioning centers at these nurseries. And so after you decant the babies from the bottles and they grow up to be old enough to be able to sort of respond to stimuli, one caste would be presented flowers and books. And these were going to be the working class workforce dregs that were not supposed to be thinking about anything intellectual and were not to be admiring nature in any way. So he does like this. It's basically the little Albert experiment on a mass scale. So he takes the babies out. And one of the characters in there, his name's Helmholtz Watson. Well, Watson is reference to John B. Watson. Okay. And Helmholtz is Hermann von Helmholtz. He's a German scientist. But so they go out and condition. So, I mean, Huxley is telling you that's 1931, right? He's telling you in that book, I mean, at least in his world, and his brother was Julian Huxley, who set up,
UNESCO.
General of UNESCO, right? He was president of the British Eugenics Society. He's the guy that coins the term transhumanism, which is where, and if you read, I can't remember what it is. It's either a book that was written when Aldous died, and it's like letters from various people that knew him, like his brother, and it's either in there or it's in a different piece where Julian basically says all this came to me for ideas, right? So in other words, what I'm saying is that, you got this guy who becomes the head of what you might call the world state in Aldous' novel, that being Julian, and head of eugenics, transhumanism. For these people, right, I think they always sort of conceived of a point at which you would synthesize the sciences of nature and nurture, psychology and eugenics, for a more, I guess, holistic or full spectrum conditioning of the human species. So that's sort of like how you would engineer the individuals. But then, right, then as far as the collective, this is where, this is going to set the precedent for or create the categories by which you would condition, whether psychologically or biologically, that being, right? In other words, you're going to, in the case of Brave New World, you're conditioning various castes to do perform particular workforce skills. And those workforce skills obviously are going to have to serve the world state, right? So at this point, we're talking about basically conditioning the mind and the body to be obedient workforce drones to serve the higher synthesis, to use Hegelian terms, right, which is going to be the ultimate state, which he called, right, God marching on earth, would be this world state. And in that, the way that is sort of engineered is through what we just mentioned in terms of the round tables, right? I mean, so if you wanted to look at the sort of the global superstructure, you can kind of look at it like at sort of the epicenter. Now, I might actually put at the very epicenter organizations like the Order of Skull and Bones, and there's others. It's not just the Order of Skull and Bones at Yale. I mean, there's the Scroll and Key, there was the Manuscript Society, there was Book and Snake, there's Wolf's Head, and these are just at Yale, right? I would imagine that every, especially the older Ivy League colleges, have some form of these, right? Oxford has its Rhodes Society. Okay, and out of that
Rhodes.
Right, this is where we get the round table structure.
Yeah,
right? Because Lord Milner is in that circle. Lord Milner comes up with his own round tables. Out of that, you get the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and you get the Council on Foreign Relations. Later on, out of that,
he was a funder of the Tavistock Institute initially as well.
Who?
Yeah, Milner, Lord Milner.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And so yeah, so those are sort of the early round tables. Eventually you get Bilderberg Group, and then you get your Club of Rome in 68, and then you get World Economic Forum, it's early 70s, and then not too long after that, you get Trilateral Commission. These are sort of the think tanks where you get, the world's global leaders, whether it be business, political, finance, media, right? They sort of get these ideas together. They take those
steering committees, right?
Steering committees, yes, and then those ideas get sort of funneled out to these global governance institutions. So your United Nations, World Health Organization, IMF, World Bank, right? They sort of carry out those global directives, right? And these partnerships with various nation states, and you also have the multinational corporations helping drag that along. Which, if you look at something like, I just wrote a piece not too long ago called it's a series on the unions and how the teachers' unions are tied into something. It's a global union. It's called Education International, and they're
global. It's a global unit.
Yeah, which is, you know what I mean? So it's like, if a union is supposed to do anything, it's supposed to be organized labor, meaning it's supposed to be organizing and telling the company what they want, right, for just compensation. At what point a global institution should be involved in that? I don't see how anybody can make any logical sense of that.
It's almost like an oxymoron, but
backwards. It's why you see it's why you see the unions, they'll protest. They want, more mental health counselors, which that's a whole other ball of wax that we'll probably get into, but which it's basically to implement more socio-emotional learning, which is to do more values clarification, indoctrination, and also to data mine the students' emotional algorithms and put them in social credit and so forth. But you won't see the unions protest against vaccine mandates. You won't see them protest against data mining. You'll see them promote all that. Why? Because they're getting their directives, not just from the state union, not just from the national union, they're getting it from the global union. And some of the board so on Education International, Randy Weingarten, who's the head of the AFT, American Federation of Teachers, she's on the board. Okay, she's on the board of EI, Education International. Lily Eskelsen Garcia, who was the president of the NEA at one point, she was the vice president of Education International. The people that founded Education International were Albert Shanker, that guy that I mentioned. He was the president of the AFT for like almost 30 years. He's the guy that came up with the idea of charter schools, public-private partnerships. Another one of the founders was Mary Hatwood Futrell. She was the president of the NEA. Okay, and so they're all tied in, and the piece I wrote recently shows that Education International is part of this thing called it's UNESCO's Global Education Coalition. It's all about facilitating distance learning in the COVID era. It's got Huawei, IBM, Google, Microsoft, all the big tech companies you can think of are involved. Right? And I can't remember the specific one, but it's pretty much almost everyone you can think of, right, is part of it, and then a bunch of other smaller ed tech companies. And I'm pointing that out because in that sort of model that I'm laying out, where you have the roundtables at the epicenter, then you have these global governance institutions outside of it, then you have these multinational corporations that partner not just with some of the roundtable organizations, but with those global governance organizations. And then it's through the partnerships between the global governance institutions and the multinational technology companies. Their partnerships with nation states is how it ultimately goes from the roundtable down to, in my instance, the Department of Education. And you see it very subtly, just like in the language in an email, like, oh, we've got a new community-based program. We're gonna include all the stakeholder, and they're using that language that is basically the lexicon of this larger global project. So that's sort of the infrastructure of the system that sort of sets the precedence for how we want to condition and engineer the individual bodies and minds, and then those bodies and minds get sort of funneled into that system.
Right. Wow. All right, let's get into the technocratic, which I do see as kind of the ultimate synthesis of the Hegelian system that they've set up, right? You have the communist, socialist, whatever on this side and on the left, and then you have like the fascist corporate. Although I think fascism really is kind of left, but ultimately they're these two different competing in theory, and then they're going to march in with their grand solution, which is the technocracy, and that will save us all from humanity. Just like didn't that what Limits of Growth said that the biggest enemy of man was man. So
yeah. I think that's actually it's Club of Rome. I think it's the so there's Limits to Growth 72, there's Limits to Growth 2 or Beyond Limits, which is 92, and then there's the first global revolution. I think it's in the first global revolution.
So they said it in Limits of Growth, but in the global revolution, what they admitted was that they came up with that because they needed to create a common enemy to get everybody to rally behind the nonsense, because they knew that that nobody was going to buy this, that, whoa, the environment is in, this danger and going to collapse, tomorrow. So they realized, but if they created a common enemy, then everybody's going to get behind it. And that common enemy is just man. So that's why they need to reduce all of us. So,
and that's, and this gets us from transhumanism to post-humanism, right? And the only time that we use that term, the root of that word, post-humanism, which is posthumous, meaning dead, right? The only time we use that is when human beings are obsolete, no longer in the picture, right? Are removed from the equation. So, it's not a, so from transhumanism or technocracy to posthumanism, or from technocracy to transhumanism to posthumanism. Technocracy is basically it's a good way to synthesize, like you said, sort of the two most popular versions of totalitarian statecraft in the last half of a century, right? Which is communism and fascism. Right. One is considered left wing, and one is considered right wing, right? And but what they both have in common is that they are the merger of the public and the private, public-private partnerships, right? They're the merger of the state and business, right, or the corporations. And Sutton gets into this, in great detail in many of his books. I mean, it's not just his book on the order. He's got his, Wall Street, the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler.
Yep.
So basically, what the two have in common is basically that totalitarian synthesis, and it's it kind of is semantic, if you ask me. I mean, if you get into if you talk to academics, they like to get really, really I guess precise is the nice word. Okay.
Good euphemism. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, oh, well, I remember like fascism. Well, that's not fascism unless so a lot of times people use sort of the colloquial, Mussolini's quote, which is, an apocryphal quote, right? But most people, when we talk about fascism in a colloquial sense, we're talking about corporatism, right? We're talking about, that quote, that apocryphal quote, the merger of the perfect merger of corporations in the state. Okay, but academics will say, well,
monopoly capitalism. Yeah, sorry, go on.
yeah, or what does Sutton call it? Corporate socialism, right? I mean, so you know what I mean? Like, but they'll say something like, well, no, you also need extreme nationalism, you need xenophobia, you need military belligerence, you need all these other things, right? And but at the same time, I think the reason why in academics, let's just be honest, not to paint with an overly broad brush, but they're pretty mostly very left, right? I mean, look, I all through, and even now, right? Like, socialism is not it's not something you blush about in academia, right? I mean, they have Marxist critical, that's what critical theory ultimately comes out of, right? I mean, it's basically, the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno, sort of, instead of looking at the dialectic of, the classes, the bourgeois and the proletariat, you're just looking at the dialectic of different racial or ethnic or gender groups. But what they have in common is that, right, you are defined, your identity, whether it's or gender or sex, is defined by your oppression, right? And the dialectic of you being oppressed by whatever, whether it be, right, in the instance of the classical Marxism, right, the bourgeois, or, you know, in the instance of the new phase, right? You know, whatever is the dominant culture. You know, usually white supremacy is sort of the catch-all phrase. Yeah. But I think the reason that you know, people that are, let's just say, very academic and very left-wing, they don't like to just equate fascism with corporatism. It dovetails with this phenomena that I saw, that I think we all saw during like the COVID thing, especially at the college, was so now all of a sudden, like we sit here, we talk about socialism and left-wing this and Marxist that, but we're totally on board with Microsoft and Google and all these humongous, some of the most powerful, I mean, not just most powerful technology corporations, the most powerful companies in history. We're okay with that as long as we can use the state to wield them according to what we think is communist, Marxist, socialist, you know, utopia. Okay. And so in other words, they're not averse to corporatism. They're not averse to, you know, they just want to be in control of it. Yeah. Right? And when you get that at the end, so and the outcome, whether it be, you know, however you want to look at it, whoever has, let's just say, who holds the title, whether it's the corporation or the state. I mean, the perfect Hegelian synthesis of those two is technocracy. It's through the that's the intermediary, as I've sort of illustrated, at least with the schools, right? It's the technology companies that easily bridge the public and the private, because you can easily outsource public services to a private technology company with a click of a button, right? Like you don't need to have a whole new corporate workforce come in, right? You just need to have this application like plugged in.
AI eventually, yeah.
Yeah, and so eventually, like where the technocracy will go is basically social credit.
Yeah.
The first time I saw, there's a documentary, Journeyman TV documentary. It gives you a good visual representation of what we're talking about, because so as I was writing my book, so this is before COVID. All right. So I think I started writing it. If you want to start with the first article, it's before Trump is in office. All right. It's maybe a year or so before.
Okay.
And you know, I'm thinking I got like 10, 15 years to sort of sound the alarm bells before we get anywhere near, you know, where we're very close to already. And, you know, I started to sort of follow some of these little breadcrumb trails, these little rabbit holes. And I started to see these overlaps between the education and healthcare, education and criminal justice, education and workforce training. And it's like, well, hold on. Like, isn't healthcare like HHS, and isn't education Department of Ed? Like, are there totally different statutes that like, right, oversee these different, like, you can't just merge these two things together, right? Like, because you know, HIPAA laws are different than FERPA laws. HIPAA, right, having to do with healthcare, FERPA having to do with education. All right. So I started to look at, well, if you look at some of the way that they're written, especially when it comes to partnerships with technology corporations, there's sort of like these loopholes where, like, if you don't identify the students, right, with what's called PII, personally identifiable information, you can take any data you want, right, as long as you don't identify where that data came from in terms of the individual. You can take that data, those algorithms, and then you could use it to refine AI more efficiently, and you know, and so forth. And you could use it to build this AI apparatus. Okay, but then, you know, I thought, well, okay, so it's going to take time for them to sort of merge these two sets of statutory codes. It's going to take time for them to whittle away sort of the firewalls between what should be different departments, right, of governance. With COVID, obviously, that, you know, that sort of, they just smashed it all together immediately, right? But when I saw the social credit system in China, I was like, that's it. Like, that's what it looks like when you take that ed tech application that's data mining their cognitive behavior
Yeah.
algorithm, their stimulus response stuff that we just talked about. And
Yeah.
you start to correlate it with their medical records in the Department of Health. So now you've got your bio data with your psych data. So now you're getting to the point where we're merging basically the eugenic data and the psychometrics. Okay. And then you add that to the criminal justice. In other words, oh, this kid's algorithms say he's not thinking so good. You know, he's got his family history of crime. So that algorithm, maybe we should have some interventions for that kid to make sure that he's not at risk. And then so now you can medicalize learning and you can criminalize the medical basis for the learning. And when you do that, you get basically social credit, where you can't operate in any sphere of society, whether public or private, whether commercial services or public, without having everything all in alignment, right? And when I saw that documentary, you know, it shows you that they data mine everything that they do online. They everything they do in real space, you know, with the facial recognition cameras. They even have the Focus One headgear, which is it's an EEG helmet that they put on the kids in schools, and that's going to data mine their brain waves, and they're going to infer socio-emotional algorithms from it, and that gets funneled into that social credit database. So they're taking all these different data sets, and based on that, this determines whether you get access to jobs, whether you get access to higher education, employment, housing, transportation. You can get put on a political blacklist. And so that when I saw that, I realized that that's the end game. That's the model. And that's why largely, you know, it's been a lot of American companies that have financed that. In particular, BlackRock and Salesforce are two. They funded the Alibaba Group, which runs the Alipay system, which runs Sesame Credit System, which was the pilot for social credit in China. So.
Wow. So it was BlackRock who funded the Alibaba and Sesame, and then who was the other company?
Salesforce.
I'm not as familiar with Salesforce.
Salesforce is huge. It's so Mark Benioff is the head of Salesforce. Mark Benioff is a trustee of the World Economic Forum. Okay, and
Larry Fink is like a chairman also. So yeah.
What's that?
Larry Fink is also on the World Economic Forum.
Oh yeah,
he's like a chairman. Yeah.
No. And that was the other thing. So I mentioned, you know, you got all those companies that I mentioned that are in the Global Education Coalition that partner with UNESCO. Most of them are also partners with the WEF, which you can go on their website and it's list all their partners. Okay, so it's public record. So here's a clear overlap between, you know, as I mentioned, right, those multinational corporations, global governance institutions, and these roundtable organizations that basically are the think tanks. But Alibaba and Salesforce largely does like analytics for businesses, like marketing analytics and things like that. I think Salesforce partners with at least one of the colleges where I adjunct at. They're pretty big. Yeah. Well, and actually, he also so Benioff financed something called Nearpod. Nearpod is an ed tech device that does adaptive learning. Adaptive learning is the modern Skinner box. So, you know, Skinner his teaching machines were analog at first, and so if you go on the Smithsonian website, you can see them. They're like a little box, and there's these two slots, and there's these round cards, and on the round card you have learning stimuli in one slot, which goes in those open holes, with learning stimuli being, you know, question answer, multiple choice, matching, something like that. And then on the other one, you scribe your answer, you go in one direction. When you turn the wheel, you get instant feedback, you know, so that's how they personalize and individualize it, because you can work at your own pace. Right. Eventually, they take his analog, you know, machines with gears and wheels. They make them electronic. They had early IBM models, and there was a big showcase document called "Teaching Machines and Programmed Learning" that I have. It was like 1960-ish, all based on Skinner stuff. And then eventually, you move from those early, you know, green screen DOS, you know, IBM big bulky computers to the modern, you know, digital adaptive learning application, which is just basically replace the gears and wheels with clicks on a mouse, or, you know, keys on a keyboard. Right. it's more sophisticated now because it can actually quantitatively data mine algorithms, not just did the student get it right, but like how long did they spend on each question, right? Like how fast did they complete them all together, right? All these different metrics in terms of like how long did it take, how many did they get wrong, how quick on any given question. That all is going to determine, right, the next question. Like, if you did really good really fast, well, we'll bump you up, right? If it took you too long, we're going to remediate you. You got to do this question again, okay? And so Nearpod is one of those devices. And I think it also, the Nearpod is building some VR stuff as well.
Oh wow. You were saying that there was some technology, tech ed involved with social emotional learning.
Yeah.
Let's
those
talk
are
about that.
largely the biofeedback wearables.
Right. I remember those. Yeah.
Old school. Actually, so the files that I have on UNESCO Study 11, they're over there in that box. I'm not going to bother. I'll probably pull out some things, show you some interesting graphics, but I don't want to do that. I'm already doing what I don't want to do, which is digress too much. So the guy that gave Charlotte this package, right? So it had all the UNESCO Study 11 files. It had a bunch of academic journals that had ads for the AECT, which is the main contract of Project BEST, and it also had stuff in there like the reprints of the white papers in the academic journals, which were also had ads for Microsoft, IBM, and Apple. So all the people that are involved in UNESCO Study 11 are promoted by the academic journals. But he wrote this piece. It's on my database. You can get it on my database. It's under his name, Lawrence Grayson, Lawrence P. Grayson. I should call him Larry Grayson. And it's on, I want to say it's like 70s. I don't know if it's earlier, late 70s, but it was on ed tech and privacy. Like he saw, this is why he gave her these files, some of the implications of this stuff. Now he actually was involved in setting up some of the first computer ed systems in the country, and they were in Alaska. And it was largely, the reason they picked it with Alaska is because, you're remote and things. So maybe you can have access to more resources through these terminals. But he, very early on saw like where this tech could go. He was also, he was an engineer. Okay. Was his background. He's awarded some awards by the IEEE. I can't remember. It's Institute for Electronics and Electrical Engineers. I think it's a big deal. But what he saw was he was talking about where now the transcranial stimulation or the fMRI, the helmets and the headgear that data mines EEGs, in other words, your brain waves. Those they had pilots for those in the 70s, and he was like warning about them in the 70s. Okay, so all this stuff is old. It's just now becoming readily available at the commercial level and obviously subsidized by federal dollars, like the CARES Act. But so that's one example is the EEG headbands or helmets. You also have stuff that data mines heart rate, so EKGs or ECGs. And then you also have something like it's called like galvanic skin response monitors, and this can infer the intensity of the emotions that someone is experiencing based on skin conductivity. And then the last one, which is in a biofeedback wearable, would be like facial recognition stuff. Okay, so basically what they do is they can infer emotional states based on the brain waves, the heart rates, skin conductivity, or the facial expressions. And obviously an aggregate of all three of those is going to give you, all right, a sort of a high quality, high definition picture of what's going on. And they've got them broken down into sort of like, relatively broad categories. So like, is the student frustrated? Is the student confused? Do they enjoy the lesson? Are they daydreaming? Right. Things like that. And so, and then they'll take that and personalize the lesson based on that. Right. Like if he's daydreaming, right, you might go over, hey, little Jimmy, pay attention or something. Or if the student is confused and he or she is shy, you can go, oh, look, his little EEG says he's confused. Let me go over and check on him. And that's how they sort of piece it all together. But obviously, when you start talking about, when you have these values clarification or critical theory, sort of like woke identity politics, indoctrination lessons embedded, you can also see, does the student like averse to like, these different identity categories, right? Do they not want to identify with this category, or do they feel like whatever they might identify as is being, packaged or referenced in a way that, right, that they're not comfortable with? So it also has the potential, for sort of political PC monitoring. Okay, but take all that, and then that's just one metric that would go in your social credit database, as they do in if you want to see an image of it, you can go just type into search engine Focus One, Brain Co, Wall Street Journal. And then you should get a video, Wall Street Journal video, that shows you these kids wearing this halo or headband. It's called Focus One, created by a company called Brain Co. It also works on other types of brain-computer interfaces. But the Focus One headband in particular was engineered through a partnership between a Chinese state-owned electronics corporation and several academics from Harvard. So again, we have a public-private partnership between the West and the East, between the United States and China. And that's just one example, Focus One. There's also Betsy DeVos, former Secretary of Education. She was either on the board or of directors or a trustee of a company called Neurocore, very similar. It's a headband. They trafficked in, they do stuff for like businesses and like sports training, stuff like that. But some of it was like ADHD training. Like, so they would, it's like gamified. So you'd like sit and watch this game or this movie, play this game or watch this movie. And if your attention based on the electrodes where your attention is focused, if it is off, it gives you some sort of a signal, to sort of like, oh, I'm right, I need to get back to the game, and it's supposed to condition the students to be able to focus better when they're learning. In the realm of the ECGs or EKGs, you have like heart math. So it's the Heart Math Inc., Heart Math Institute. Those are a few of the wearables.
Right.
Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation financed some of the GSR bracelets. Another company involved in GSR bracelets is it's called Effectiva, and that company also actually traffics in or specializes in behavioral advertising algorithms. Right. So the behavioral advertising, or in other words, personalized advertising, that's the phenomena you experience when you go and you want to buy some shoes or something, and then you go on your social media and there's an ad for those shoes because it's data mining, right? These purchase preferences based on these cookies, and they take that and then they give you a personalized ad based on it. So those effective engineers those types of algorithms, and actually a company called Dreambox, which is an adaptive learning technology corporation. So in other words, it makes those types of apps that come out of the Skinner box technology. They explicitly trace their adaptive learning tech not just only back to Skinner box teaching machines. They also trace it back to or they show that they are almost identical to the types of behavioral or personalized algorithms that you get from Netflix is the example they use. Okay, so that's it's important. It's interesting to note because it's not just sort of like this. The algorithms are not necessarily just academically inclined or inclined towards the curriculum, right? Like they're sort of intimately embedded with these other types of corporate algorithms that are trying to engineer good little consumers. So you're basically conditioning people to be both worker bees and consumers, all in one package.
That's very convenient for creating a feudal system. I guess the question would be, just to play devil's advocate, because I think where people who want to argue against this, well, what's wrong with having technology that helps children who are ADD or, with their having some sort of challenge, that this technology is going to help them, right? Because that's usually how they couch it, that these are designed for beneficial purposes. And not to say that none of them can't help. I mean, I'm sure some of them really actually could be beneficial, but what is it that they're really intending to do with all of this?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things involved.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, all right. So at one level, and I had somebody at the AFA conference asking me this about, they expressed that they hoped I would have been slightly more favorable to behavioral psychology in the realm of learning, and in particular for people, that are in alternative ed, meaning like, what they call behavioral disorders, right? You're a troublemaker or something, right? You misbehave, you don't do your work, things like that. You can't focus, you got ADHD, you got disciplinary problems. I mean, at one level, the idea of punishment and reward, right? And having like schedules and routines. I mean, this predates psychology, right? I mean,
sure.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, I mean,
human nature.
Yeah, you know what I mean? It's the basis of discipline, which you need to do anything effectively, constructively, at a high level for a long term. Like I always say, like, I love reading, I love writing. It doesn't matter how much I love it and enjoy it. At a certain point, you get burnt out, right? Like at a certain point, it's like at a certain point it becomes an effort. It's not just like, oh, just enjoy. It's like, man, I got a deadline. I got to finish this, right? And so that requires some kind of discipline, which requires, right, some kind of, an orderly schedule.
Yeah.
And, giving yourself some sort of, consequences, whether they be positive or negative, right, to sort of motivate you to keep going when you sort of hit the wall. Okay, so that, I mean, like, to the extent that you could say that, the behavioral sciences, maybe they refine some of those methods a little bit. I mean, but again, I don't necessarily. It's sort of like word concept fallacy. I don't think that because you are going to help a child who has some behavioral issues in the classroom through some method of discipline, hopefully self-discipline. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily a behaviorist, right? Like,
right.
So that's my first thing.
I always say that, I studied, the field of psychology. I was very fascinated by that. I wrote 285 PhD theses in high school on dream analysis. But the more I studied it, the more I felt like it was, really just Marxism. And then when I learned more about it, it really just seems like it was derived from occultism. And I think it's and when you learn about Tavistock, I think there really does seem to be some convergence there. But I think that they essentially just put a secular solution to spiritual problem. And again, this is not, I'll qualify by saying it's not that the field of psychology has never done anything to help anybody. That's not what I'm saying. My mom's a psychologist, she's done wonderful work. I know some really, really wonderful people who have done incredible work with people. But I think that is essentially what it was intended to do, is to create this secular solutions to spiritual problems. And as you said, the psyche was known as the soul, right? So.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And then there's, and Maslow gets pushed a lot in education psychology, and like that it's sort of the flip side of what's involved in a lot of some of basically the values clarification and some of the woke stuff, which is that the idea here is that the students can become self-actualized through manifesting their whatever it might be, class, race, gender, that particular identity. But if you know the history of Maslow, and sort of his ideas. I think I have it over here. I don't know. There it is. Yeah, toward the psychology.
Self-actualization.
Second edition. The guy says that his various the fourth force of psychology. So he says the first two forces of psychology were the psychoanalytic and the behavioral. The third was his humanistic or positive. The fourth was what he called his transpersonal or quote transhuman psychology. Right. And he was totally tied into Esalen and so he was basically a new ager. So for him, right, this idea of self-actualization, we could talk about it in terms of just right cognition or consciousness or like psychology from sort of an academic or even materialist perspective. And in some ways, you could hold that sort of a priori framework and still be sort of Maslowian, but for him it wasn't, right? For him it was like a spiritual thing, right? And so,
and New Age is just a more modern rendition of occultism. I mean, it was Blavatsky who popularized it as the New Age movement, but yeah.
100%, yeah, and that's where I was going. Is that so?
Sorry.
Oh no, good, because I probably would have been more verbose than necessary, right? So that's like 100%, and but so as far as like the technologies, like how they might be useful to the students, okay, then the other realm is like, let's say students have, I don't know, some emotional difficulties that prevent them from learning, which is possible, right? And I have students when they tutor and students sometimes. And they come in and, after a relatively long session, it's kind of like, they finally realize after I kind of walk them through the steps, like, oh, I'm just overthinking this. Yeah, it's overthinking it. Like, and that might be from, maybe that's just some self-esteem issues that they have that they bring to the table before they come to the school. Maybe sometimes that's because the school, told you that you weren't smart for however long, which happens a lot of times, right? The student's not interested. They don't want to participate, right? They got other things on their mind. Therefore, they don't turn the work in. Therefore, they get bad grades. Then the teacher says you're not smart. Then the peers reinforce it. Then you believe it, which means now you don't try. Then one day you go to try. Let's say you're like me and you don't go to college right out of high school. You kind of try to figure some stuff out. When you do go to college, right? Every time you try to learn something, all you can hear in the back of your head is, right, I'm not smart and all the other things that other people have told you. Well, and so what I'm saying is there is an emotional component to learning. Sure. It's just like anything, right? I mean, like just like a good example of what I just mentioned about writing that book, right? Like it's not just a cognitive process. Like I have to when I don't feel like it, I have to push myself to do it, right? And and that's at the affective or emotional level. It's not just like a logical, like, oh, I know this, therefore, right? Like you have to like push through it. And but to the extent that stuff gets like that is under the realm of education, there's a couple issues with it. I mean, first of all, right, we're talking about again now we're sort of medicalizing, right, the learning process, okay, in the sense of, right, we're bringing basically mental health or clinical psychology into educational psychology, and the implications that has for the broader spectrum of social engineering. But then the other part is like, these types of programs sometimes get you on like a hamster wheel that you can't really get off of, right? Like it sometimes reinforces, like, so if you take that same student, you say, well, it's not your fault that you can't learn because you have a learning disability. And I'm not saying they don't exist, but let's say, like I do think that they are over diagnosed. I will say that, right? Then what it becomes is the student caps themselves because they go, right? It's worse than just having the teacher and the peers say like, oh, you're not that smart, because like, it might just be my teacher was a jerk and so are the people around me, right? But if I've got some kind of a medical clinical diagnosis, with maybe an algorithm behind it, right? Like that's harder for someone to sort of, push back against, because at that point, it's not just the opinion of a teacher or a peer, right? It's like, this is backed by science, right? And so then what they do is then they come to the table and think like, okay, so that means I'm not going to be able to perform at this level, and therefore either they're not going to try for that higher level, or which is a very common experience when tutoring, is a lot of students, they basically approach tutoring as you're doing half the work for the student, as opposed to you're trying to, like, so in the realm of writing, it's like we always say in a writing center, like, we don't make better papers, we make better writers.
Sure.
So in other words, right, when you come with a paper, and I give you some feedback on what you need to do. I'm not editing it for you. I'm not rewriting it, right? I'm showing you what's working and what's not. I'm giving you a few tools and skills to apply to those areas. Then you work on it and you come back. We see how you did. And if there's some things we tweak, and then eventually through that process, right? You should first thing should be you start to be able to ask the questions of yourself that I ask you. Right. So you can look at the paper and the questions I would ask you to show you like what's working and what's not, you can start to ask those questions and find it. And then eventually, if you can ask the questions, you can get to the answer. If you get to the answer, eventually you should, a successful tutoring operation should be that you eventually stop coming. Right. And
Right.
A while. Okay. It doesn't have to be like the first time, but a lot of times you get students to come back and it's like they haven't really worked on it.
Right.
Like they, you sort of model a couple of fixes, examples, and they come back and it's like, and this is anecdotal. I think a lot of that has to do with, right, what we're talking about in terms of like, overly, I guess, pathologizing, what may or may not be a mental issue. And then but when you start adding the algorithms and you start merging the Department of Health with the Department of Education and eventually you don't just get to this point where the student is sort of stuck in a less than favorable self-perception, self-esteem. A lot of that might come with like, oh, well, you need medication.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So now it's like, oh, with these, you give them the tech for the help the ADHD, and the algorithm only gets them so far. Well, hey, let's so now you give them some Ritalin or something like that, right? And then after that, right, you can take that data and put it in the social credit system, and then that social credit system now, let's say you use the app, you do the cognitive training, you take your medication. Okay, you do all the things that they say you need to do based on how they've categorized your mental health.
Right.
And you do them all to your best ability and you do them all on time in accordance with, the requirements. You're still going to be capped because, you know what I mean? Like the fact that you even have to do those, you work on those apps, take those medications, it's going to put you in a different social score category than somebody who doesn't. Right. So what I'm saying is that, at the worst end of the spectrum, I mean, at the lowest end of the spectrum is it sort of breeds misperceptions about the student's self that cap the student's motivation and ability to reach certain levels. At the worst end of the spectrum, you not only put that student in that state of mind, but you take that data and you basically dictate their future based on all this stuff in the past. And when I was in high school, I was not the best student. Like if you took all my high school records and said, you know what I mean? And like decided where I could have went to college and, what jobs I could have got, like I probably wouldn't be teaching college. Right. You know what I mean? Like, and a lot of what changed wasn't, it was largely, me just realizing I had to have a certain level of self-discipline, right? And then there's one more thing is that when you talk about especially behavioral psychology, and when you go to the extreme, someone like Skinner, and you say that all learning, all cognition, all consciousness is just, it's basically ephemeral. It's basically like, there's an analogy that you all know Harari has for like, well, we don't know what consciousness is. It's in Homo Deus. And he says, one theory is that it could just be like the roar of an engine when a plane is going through the sky. The roar of the engine doesn't do anything. It doesn't propel the plane. It's just it's a byproduct of energy, right? And so all the things that you think are your thoughts and your ideas and your self-concept, and that's just the noise that comes out of that's sort of ephemeral to these neurological, electrical responses to the environment. Well, when you do that, you basically hamstring the mind. Like you basically make it impossible for a student to have any self-agency in where they go, what they want to do. how they respond to the stimulus, whether or not they want to respond to the stimulus, right? Whether or not they want to, do a 180 and practice, some sort of, self-discipline or whatever. Like you basically turn the student into a mechanism, right? I mean, so that's the other part is that, that you basically, and this is basically the opposite of the classical method. Okay, it's teaching people what to think rather than teaching them how to think. But it's even worse than that because in their theory, there's no thinking going on.
Right.
You're just basically you're just winding up the automaton and programming them to push buttons and pull levers.
Right. Right. And they see nothing wrong with it because they don't think there is any thought process anyway.
Right. So there is no right or wrong, right? It's just, and he says that. He said that, he says that there is no such thing as bad. Like you can't say that the student is bad, or doesn't is misbehaving. It's not the student's fault. It's the teacher's fault. It's the environment's fault. It's the Department of Ed's fault. You didn't give that student the right stimuli to respond to. But the other thing about that that's wrong about that is like, okay, here's another theory that it's called gamification. Mm-hmm. It builds on stimulus response and Skinnerian psychology and all that. But it's this premise that, all right, so we're still going to use, right, we're going to condition the students' learning or their thoughts and behaviors based on how they respond to these learning stimuli. And, one of the main places that they really want to start to make gamify more and more is going to be in the metaverse because you can have like 3D real world simulations. But the idea here is that, right, if I just give you questions and answers and it's data mining you and, and you're, I remember I used to get bored when I used to take the standardized tests. You start spelling words, dad, bad, cab, right? Whatever. I didn't get graded for this. This just goes to the state, and so you're just like, whatever, I want to get this done. Right. So that type of a stimulus response, right, is not going to motivate the student to learn as effectively as if it's entertaining or fun or with a game. So if you turn it into a game, then they'll have fun doing it, and they won't even know they're learning because they're just playing the game.
Playing games, yeah.
Well, except as I just mentioned, right? I mean, with using my example of me writing a book or doing my own research or writing articles, there's a curve, right? There's a point at which no matter how much fun something is or how much you enjoy it, you hit the wall where not only do you get burnt out from just doing it, I mean, necessarily the monotony, but to get to a higher level of knowledge or consciousness or ability, you have to be on the precipice of what you already know, which is never comfortable, which is always difficult, which is always a struggle. In other words, you can't gamify something that simulates how you traverse that sort of that wall in that process of raising your consciousness, so to speak, right? So, so it's inescapable. At some point, learning has to be challenging and difficult because you have to be on the precipice. So it's just this idea that this is a terrible example. I mean, this is a terrible story. My dad always says, when are you going to use that example to illustrate this? And I have a friend of mine told me, this is the first time I've remembered in like 2 years. All right. And it's a friend of mine. He's actually one of my professors. I keep in touch with him.
Okay.
And he used to help with kids that are on the spectrum, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. And he read my book and we was talking about the behavioral psychology. And he was like, yeah, like that stuff is like, it's not even, it's in his opinion. And he actually has a daughter that's on the spectrum. Okay. So I mean, it's not just that. It's not just he had a little experience in this school, like
right.
His
sure, it's personal for him. Yeah.
Yeah. So you know what I mean. And he's like, it doesn't work, and he said it's basically it's horrific. He said at this place that these kids, what they did was everything was all about either. So it's all positive reinforcement. Okay, so they don't do any, there's no punishment involved, right? So it's all right. And so the way that you get these kids to behave, right, and then to perform whatever you want to do, whatever you want to do, learn or, otherwise, because it's in a group home. So it might just be, they need to do chores or whatever, right?
Right.
Either give them cut up sandwiches into slices, and you feed them a sandwich as a reward, or you give them TV time. And he told me that everybody, I shouldn't laugh. I mean, it's so absurd. I always laugh when I say it's super disturbing. But he said that he said he left when everybody was giving themselves a round of applause because they thought that they had achieved a new level of compliance by taping sandwiches to the TV screen. And it got these kids to basically just kind of zombie out. But I mean, and it's sort of an extreme example, but it kind of illustrates what I'm getting at, right? Like if you follow this idea that making things fun and entertaining and rewarding, if you just make it rewarding and fun enough that then everyone would be a genius. No, if you take it to the extreme, you'll be taping sandwiches on a TV and the kids won't be thinking anything.
Right. Right.
So,
yeah, I think sports are a really good example. I mean, we were talking before about like getting back into running, right? If you do the same, even let's say you are a runner, if you do the same 2 miles every day, you're never going to get, to the point where you could run like 10 miles in one stretch, right? You have to at some point push a little bit further and challenge yourself a little bit more. Otherwise, then when there's just one obstacle, like maybe there's a hill or maybe there's, different kind of weather, it's going to be that much more difficult. And I think that's just a really like concrete example for people. It's kind of like, the same thing with you if you lift weights. If you keep lifting the same weight over and over again, not that there's anything wrong with it, but you're probably not going to get to the point where you're gonna break that record, So yeah, you have to challenge yourself just a little bit more. So. And I think the same thing with education. They can't just be, in a fun. And I don't think there's. I think there's a time and place for that. I think there's, to have there be some fun and diversified way for them to learn, and engage them. Mostly, it's to engage them. But after that, there has to be some sort of
and
challenge.
It's sort of I think my athletic background largely is in martial arts. I mean, it's some amateur competitions and stuff. I mean, I did it for 22 years. And I took it very seriously. I mean, I kind of fell off during COVID, and I'm trying to get back into it now. But I think of it like so to me, the fun part was sparring and grappling. Right? So you got to take all the knowledge that you got, and that's still hard in terms of you got to getting punched and kicked, and you're tired, and you know what I mean. Like, so there's still that you have to push through that,
for sure.
wall. But you can't even. But that's still fun because it's very creative, it's spontaneous. You know what I mean? It's not like we're going to do this routine today, right? Like,
right.
You can't actually spar or grapple in a way that's going to be enjoyable if you don't do the repetitive stuff.
Yeah,
like you have to run, right? You have to condition yourself. You have to lift weights, right? You have to do all this stuff to get your body where you can actually spar for an hour and not be running out of gas after 2 rounds. And you know what I mean? Right. And that's another thing that gets a bad rap is rote learning. I mean, I'm sorry to say it. I know I probably sound like a bumpkin, archaic dinosaur or whatever, but I just, in my own, I can say this because I can speak from my own experience, right? There's a certain level at which, and to use the analogy of conditioning, at which like you have to do some rote memorization of concepts and ideas and things. Like the only reason I can, when I write an article, right, it takes me, I can write it, do all the research, have it all checked out, but I can't really talk about it on the fly right away, right? Like I have to break it down into like notes, and this is old notes, but I mean, it's just like, I need to like pull out, because I'm not going to talk about every sentence, so I need to get the who, what, where, when, and then I usually draw a little flow chart, and then if I talk about it a few times, and the more interviews I do where it comes up, then eventually it's there, and I can pull it off.
Right.
But I have to do some level of just remembering the who, the what, the where, and the when before I can go to how and why, on the fly like that. And, that's largely discouraged in academia anymore. I mean, and this is sort of off topic, but like, the whole language learning, or what's known as whole word learning, basically is sort of a rejection of phonics. Phonics being in many ways rote, right? What do you do? You go through your alphabet and you make the sounds of them, and then you look at your diphthongs and your clusters, and until you can look at each letter and make the phonetic sound, you're not going to be able to very efficiently or effectively sound out words.
Right.
You're going to have to just remember like pictographs. You're going to have to remember entire concepts based on words. That's not as efficient, right? And phonics has largely been pushed to the wayside, and the Order of Skull and Bones had a lot to do with that. And Sutton talks a lot about it.
Really?
Yeah.
With doing away with phonics? And did they say? Sorry, did they say why?
The theory is that it's more effective, that the whole language learning is more effective than the phonics. I mean, Sutton and Charlotte would have said it was the beginning of, basically the title of her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down. Like they want, and Gatto says something very similar. And basically the idea is that, this isn't how they pitched it in terms of promoting it, but like someone like Gatto and Sutton and Charlotte would have said that they wanted people to be literate enough to follow orders, obey rules, be obedient,
Sure.
But not literate enough to actually ask questions, to find contradictions and things. Right? You just need to be able to know that this is the policy. You need to understand how to do the policy, and then you just need to execute it.
Right.
Yeah, their theory was that whole language learning was more effective. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I think in reference to the technology, it seems like, and when talking about rote memory, I think a lot of that has been stripped by technology. I first saw it with the calculator. We used to do basic math. The arithmetic tables, the multiplication, division, whatever, subtraction, but you would memorize them. I mean, it was drilling them. And when American students weren't doing so well in math, what did they bring in for the tutoring system? It was Kumon, right? The Japanese Kumon. And basically what it was drilling, the rote memory, memorizing, right? and that improved their scores. That's what was helpful. And then the calculators come in, and nobody does that anymore. Even people who learned it still don't do it because you don't have to. And now with cell phones, I think it's just become, exponentially magnified. People don't even memorize phone numbers anymore.
Yeah.
They don't have to remember dates, facts, anything, but they just consult, the quote unquote oracle. People really don't remember things anymore. And I think rote memory, it's very hard. And I think this is what you were really alluding to with the, the what, when, and then getting to like the how, why. You can't do an analysis of something if you don't have the foundation, and the facts are the foundation. Once you have those laid down and you know them solidly, then you can start to examine, and you can inquire, you can ask yourself questions and look at the facts and adjudicate. But
yeah. And it's I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but if you don't have the rote memory, then you have no chance of getting there. So
yeah, and it's a parallel in the old classical method, the classical trivium, right? You start with grammar, then logic, then rhetoric. Right? Grammar is basically naming, right, whatever concepts or phenomena you're trying to study. Logic is basically organizing those concepts or those names in a non-contradictory way, and rhetoric is expressing it in a non-contradictory way, right?
Sure.
And just to use the whole, the martial arts analogy again, like the grammar is like jab, right, cross,
Right.
okay, hook, okay. So logic is a combination. How do the three flow together, right? And then the rhetoric is where you're sparring, right? Is where you're basically you're not just doing a rote drill, right?
Right.
So, but you can't do a jab cross hook combination if you don't know how to throw a jab and a cross and a hook. right? And you can't be spontaneous sparring if you don't drill the patterns, right? The combinations, right? And it's so like what whole language learning kind of does is like it just inverts it. And so it's like it's the equivalent of like putting boxing gloves on a kid that's never been in a fight, never sparred, never punched a mitt, never hit a bag. Like grab another kid of the same experience, put gloves on him and say, yeah, go beat on each other and then tell me how much. Right. I mean, maybe a couple of them learned a few things about like, you know what I mean? A couple instinctive moves and then they're like, oh, that worked. And then they can do it again. But like, you know, the learning curve is going to be a lot less steep if I show you, you know, all the tools first, then we practice doing them right in combination. And then I let you do that. Right. To me, that's sort of that's a decent analogy.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. And there's also, even if you take the few exceptional students who may, you know, pick it up really quickly and they may be able to jump right in, they don't have a solid foundation. So their ability to progress is going to be capped because they never learned the foundational tools. So even though there may be some who are, you know, pretty quick and they can jump right in, they're still going to be disadvantaged because they haven't been given the foundational tools.
And the other thing is, even after you gain a high level of competence in whatever it might be, you never just quit doing the, you know, to use the drills, right? Because it's like, or the same thing with me, right? Like, or with talking about an article. If I don't talk about an article or a chapter for a while, I'll be like, oh man, I can't remember all, and I know I can't remember all the people involved, or like things get cloudy, things get vague. So
totally.
You know, it's that is a part of it. But as you mentioned, the whole thing with AI is like, you know, one of the things I looked at in the book was, so they had like some of these VR simulators. Maybe they're AR or VR. I don't know. Well, the difference is VR is right. You're immersed in this digital world with the goggles, and the AR is you got a screen either on your face or, you know, through a handheld screen, and it's going to overlay the digital icons or graphics on top of the physical world. It doesn't matter which it was for the sake of this discussion, but for the example I'm going to talk about, which is it was like so you mentioned the calculators, remember the TI-80 calculators where you could graph the parabolas and stuff, you know, your slope intercept and all that. They wanted to do they had these apps, VR, AR, where you would do it like you'd push on the screen the three vectors and then make your angle, and then that's going to give you the mathematical equation for that angle, right? As opposed to plotting the equation,
right?
Having that and then having the calculator graph that, right? Draw the parabola or the incline or whatever it is, right? And so, I mean, if you think about something like that, you can almost think of a time where it's like, why even teach slope intercept form when somebody can put like an engineer or an architect, they can go to the site where somebody's like, hey, we want you to draft us a building plan on this particular plot of land. They go out there with their little AR goggles and they start, you know, and then it'll have a little built-in, monitor that might say something like, you know, that angle won't work for this, you know, that's too steep of an incline for this roof or whatever structurally, right? It won't mesh with what you got going on with this other part of the building. But I mean, why would you need to know the math or any of the properties in terms of like, you know, the stress on the steel or right the weight bearing on the joist of a house or something, right? You can just punch in these, basically draw in this 3D world, and this thing will tell you whether or not it'll work. And, you know, that's all you need to know is how to operate the goggles, you know.
Right. Yeah. And then what happens when there's a cyber blackout or something?
We're all back to tents and thatched huts and, you know what I mean? That would be like the best. It'd be like this best thing you could do is like try to figure out, you know what I mean? Like how to weave together some reeds or something like that. I mean,
totally.
I mean, obviously that's, you know, we're speculating, but I mean, it's not impossible to imagine a time when, right, you just keep moving forward, and it's just like, you know, I mean, you know, I think you mentioned several examples, but I just think about like phones. Like I don't remember any.
Yeah.
I know people that I grew up with that I haven't seen since grade school. I still know their phone number.
Right.
I don't know anybody's phone number that I've met in the last 10 years because it's a button on my phone.
Exactly. And I remember as a kid, if you mentioned a phone number, I memorized it right away. That's just what you did. I memorized it, It wasn't, I didn't have to think about it. It wasn't like, oh, let me try and practice this. It was, I heard the number or I wrote it down and okay, now I know it, And I think that skill, I mean, some people, not everybody's going to do it on the first one, the first time they hear it. But I think that skill, I'm certainly not good at it now, and that wasn't like something I was, working really hard at as a kid, but it was because that was understood that you would need to know that number. So I think kids are being done a really big disservice by not, just being drilled any. So where do we, oh, sorry, were you going to say something? Where do you think, you were alluding to that this is going towards the social credit. What do you think, the agenda is with the kids and the education versus, I mean, I think they want everybody into like a global UBI, social credit, digital kind of feudal system. That's personally where it's, from what I've read, that's what it seems to be their goals are. But what do you think with the children and the education specifically? What is the difference there? Or is there any difference?
Okay, what do you mean the difference between what?
So, like, why are they? Because with us, I mean, with adults, there's certainly, they have Meta, they have we have our phones, there's but they're not doing all of this technological kind. It doesn't seem quite as invasive as some of these devices that they have for children in schools.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, interestingly, there is something called lifelong learning. It's a UNESCO thing, and I'm basically doing it right now because to be so when COVID happened, they did the lockdowns. Everybody went online, and at least in Illinois, probably the same in any other state, but in Illinois, you couldn't teach online unless you had a state online teaching certificate. But since the whole world was online, or at least the whole state was online, well, your class had to be converted, and then they basically, gave you a pass and let you do that. Well, about last year, and this is why, you mentioned to you, I didn't have a lot of classes this semester.
Right.
I had to go through this 3-round process. I had to do an in-house training for the one school, and then I could use that for the other school. But then, even though I could use that for the other school, the first school then said, okay, well, thanks for doing the in-house training. Now you have to do the state cert. So then I had to do the state cert. And then when I was done with the state cert, they're like, now you need to do your course development. And course development is where the IT department is going to look at the course design. And there was literally things in there like, okay, if I made a bulleted list of questions the students had to answer for like a reading quiz or something, if I didn't indent the bullets, it said it was non-accessibility. It didn't meet accessibility standards, meaning for like accessibility has to do with students that have various disabilities. So for some reason, if the numbers aren't indented, somebody, I guess they can't read them but I mean, this is the level of micromanaging and it has pretty much nothing to do with pedagogy. So, I mean, I say all that to say that, depending on what field you're in, what job you're in, like the idea of workforce of lifelong learning, as we move into this fourth industrial revolution, as things become more and more digitized, more and more automated, more and more tele this, tele that, like everybody will sort of have to be retrained, right? This is what they mean by lifelong learning. There's a so I mentioned the P20 councils. So first there's there's P16. That means preschool through 16. P20 was P through 20. So it's like all the way to college. Then there's P20 plus, which means beyond college. And then Charlotte has this document. I need to put it on my database one day, but I don't know what year the document was. It was probably either late 90s or, between 2000, 2010, something like that. It said K through 80.
What?
Yeah. So you're going to be retrained all the way until you're 80. You would hope that you're in some form of retirement by 80, to the extent.
Hopefully.
But as far as the kids, and why are they being I guess maybe why are they being introduced to some devices?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, ultimately, I mean, so we have the quantitative and the qualitative, right? So the quantitative is basically everything I mentioned in terms of just data mining, how the student thinks, how the student feels. There's something called precision education that eventually they will basically use your DNA and correlate different, your IQ and other cognitive or emotional capacities to your DNA sequences. But they want to take all that and sort of quantify, what are your capabilities? Where will you fit best in society? And how can we basically sort of nudge you in that direction?
Really brave new world. Yeah.
Yeah, and the qualitative part is going to be basically the values that that you bring to the table, as far as, in other words, conditioning the students to uphold the values that would make them basically be copacetic with whatever job or whatever role stuff is going to funnel them into, right? So it's basically, I mean, this is where you get all this communitarian, equity, woke, identity politics stuff that by basically adopting one of these various identity categories that is, reinforced by like entertainment media and even like, fashion and things like that, and then is basically further reinforced by the state in terms of like policies that will like police people who identify you incorrectly, refer to you with the wrong words. That will be that sort of is that by associating all those identity categories with the corporate state, that by participating in his identities, you will feel like you belong. You will be self-actualized, to use Maslow's term, and therefore you will be happy. You will own nothing, and you will be happy to be right. When we say this is the job that your metrics say you're built for, so this is what you're going to do. You'll be happy to do that because you'll feel like you're self-actualizing your ethnic or gender identity. Or whatever it is. So that's what I would say is sort of how the two sort of fit together. But eventually, I wonder, like, and it's again one of these things like, okay, if we keep going.
Yeah.
I mean, at what point? This is how I even started. This is part of how I started writing about the ed tech. Was like when I saw IBM Watson was data mining me. I was like, okay, so basically every day I go to work, I'm teaching this computer to replace me.
Yep.
And then I said, well, hold on. So now people always worry about like automation, AI automation. Well, it's going to replace manual labor, like robots in a factory. And I was like, that's good, because who wants to work with their hand? Me, I like to actually, but that's so it's one thing, and that's their pitch. It's only going to replace drudgery and dangerous heavy lifting, right? But we're going to be, working with the robots because we still have to, oversee the robots and program. In other words, intellectual labor will not be automated. But hold on, IBM's Watson is doing what? It's going to replace my job as a tutor for that particular role. Eventually, it would, it could potentially be a teacher, not just a tutor, but the teacher.
Yep.
It's replacing intellectual labor. Well, if you have an AI that can not just replace any form of intellectual labor, but teaching in particular, right? In other words, teaching is the art of refining intellectual labor, right? Intellectual consciousness and cognition, right? If you have a machine that can teach other humans better than a human can teach, you have a machine that makes consciousness, the intellectual process, thought itself, entirely obsolete, right? So, like, at what point, I guess, where someone like Elon Musk says, well, if you can't beat it, you got to join it. So this is where we come in with, we need the brain-computer interface, because we'll plug this thing in and you can merge with it. And, basically you can have a little AR app built into your retinas, and, you could walk around the planet, and, when you go into a store or something, let's say there was a crime just committed, it might populate in your retina with a little AR bubble that says something like "crime in progress, don't enter," or if you want to go to on a field trip with your students and you want to look at the a museum or maybe a historical monument or something, and you walk up to it and you can tap a little button and your little retina app is going to tell you the whole history of this thing, or maybe even it'll be audio or something like that, right? And so this is where, right, we'll merge, and then we'll basically be our own gods or whatever. But what do you do with the people that can't? The students that can't perform at the basic lowest levels on these different apps that basically, right? Like, will you even be a candidate for those types of AR interfaces?
Right.
Like, I would guess that, at best, you would basically be a battery. And that means like either by means of data or actual energy, meaning like you sit in the metaverse and, you can't actually contribute to the productive workforce, but we can feed you games and ads all day, and we can data mine your biopsychosocial algorithms and refine our AI more effectively. So you'll be useful in that sense, but you won't actually be participating in the real world, right? You'll just basically be a sort of a data pool, and maybe even I think there was Bill Gates had some kind of a patent on like an app that could mine blockchain or Bitcoin from bio algorithms, or maybe we could even get some actual physical energy off of you for like our new sustainable economy, right? So as you sit there, we can sort of convert some of your brain waves into, right, we can very low resolution energy. Like they've got some of these I think they piloted like at these gyms, right? Like people are on the treadmills and they're gonna like take the mechanical energy or something. Like,
right. Yeah.
I mean, obviously you're gonna get like, what are you gonna get? But I'm just saying if you can't participate, if you have no
quote unquote value, they're going to create this place where you have value. Yeah.
And you're gonna be data mined. Right? It's gonna have an entirely passive existence.
Yeah, I mean, I think Klaus actually talks about this, basically being paid to be a consumer, like essentially kind of being, for them to data mine you and be able to refine, what ads to show you essentially. And then you consume and that you get UBI for this. Like this is a great thing. So
there's that it reminds me of that one episode in Black Mirror. I think it's the first season. And it's the season where like they're all on these exercise bikes. And there's like the main character is this black guy and he likes this girl. And this girl is like he wants to watch some of her, like I guess they can do like like we're doing now. I don't know what you call it in that world because it's all very abstract. Like they live in these pods, but they can like be on these different media platforms. And like at a certain point, he uses all of his, I guess what we might call like his social credit tokens. And like in order to work back up to be able to, watch these other videos, he has to consume a certain number of ads over and over again, right? And that's how you can get your score up to, we'll give you a little bit of gamification time if you watch all these ads, and then we data mine, how you respond to them, basically.
I think Black Mirror is very much predictive programming, very much so. Well, what are your thoughts on what people can do to because I always say these are just plans at the moment, right? And there's best laid plans of mice and men. So hopefully we can do something to thwart these not so lovely plans. So what are your thoughts on any of that?
Yeah. I mean, there's it's a broader, there's layers to that question, right? Because one is like, we're talking about largely education, the realm of education. But as we've sort of, demonstrated that, the
education's one part of it. Yes,
right. And it is deeply integrated into just the larger global technocracy, right? And the merger of all sectors of economic and political life, right? So I guess we can just start with like the school level. Like, at
Yeah.
the school level, like, okay, I wrote my book as a defense of public education. I'm a public educator, right? I thought I had more time. Was hoping that, if I were to sound sort of the alarm here, that, before, when this stuff started to get rolled out, people might be like, hey man, that's like what that guy was talking about, right? Like, I think this is maybe we shouldn't do this, right? Like, or at least have a little bit of some questions to ask, which hasn't been the case in the post world. But in the wake of lockdowns and vaccine mandates, I mean, I don't have kids. We're not able to have kids, me and my wife. But if I did, I can tell you that I would not have them in any public school where they're going to be mandated to have either a mask or a vaccine.
Neither would I.
So to that extent, I mean, I'm sorry to say it, but I've largely, because I'm still a public educator. I mean,
Sure.
I still, I still try to at least give them, my students, something that they won't get from other people that are, other teachers that are, I guess, sort of bought into the whole thing. So I mean, that's hopefully something I can offer by keeping my foot in there.
Right.
But otherwise, I mean, I can't really defend the public education system in terms of like where it's moving in terms of all this technocracy. So I would say the first thing you need to do is opt out of the public school system. That includes the public private charter school system. So like, in other words, the best option is going to be homeschooling. Okay. Yeah. Homeschooling does not mean you sign up for K-12 Inc. Right? It was
sit them in front of a computer or a TV. Right. No.
A lot of people do though, because they feel like, they feel like they don't have the abilities or the skills or the knowledge to teach their children, right? And at a certain level, I mean, that might be the case. I mean, I guess for anybody that would probably be the case, at least in one area or another, right? I mean, nobody's a polymath, a polyglot, and an artist of all shades, right? And so there's always going to be something where you probably need a little bit of
outsourcing, yeah.
But then the other part is you can make it a learning process yourself, right? I mean, and you do it with the children. And
well, what a treat, right? To get to learn with your child. I feel like that would be such a incredible experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about like the generation gaps, between different parents and children. I mean, like that's a good way to shorten that gap, right? I mean, because instead of it's like everybody's on their phones or their devices in separate rooms consuming different media from different eras and different times, right? You're both like going on this journey, like neither of us really knows how exactly to do this, but we're figuring it out together, and you can actually go through that process together, and it can be a team building thing and be a bonding thing. And to the extent that you run into some sort of some walls where you feel like you're stuck, this is where you'd want to do something like a homeschool pod or a co-op. So you find other people hopefully in your local neighborhood, but you might need to close enough to where you can either go to the park or you could take turns at different people's houses, and and you have people there that you can hire, whether it just be the other parents, or maybe you want to bring in a tutor or a teacher who specializes in whatever it might be, math, science, art, language, and they can sort of fill in those gaps, and you keep tech basically out of it. Now, I mean, when I say tech, I mean 100%. I mean, no psychometric, biometric data mining, adaptive learning, or obviously, right? I mean, we're obviously those things we're talking about not using those, but I'm not saying you can't use the internet, right? I mean, open source, like Gutenberg Press, right? You can get all kinds of great classical literature for free. So that's the other part is, I mean, tech or no tech, meaning, grounded in the classical method, you can get a lot of that literature, a lot of that stuff online. There's a really nice, this guy's named Bruce Gore. He does he's a Presbyterian, but he does like history of philosophy. And
Okay.
it's little lectures. And it's actually for I think they're eighth graders. So he teaches at a classical school for eighth graders, and he like filmed some of these lectures. And I mean, when you watch it, all right, look, you get a couple of things out of it. It's like, first thing is, it's like, these are eighth graders learning this stuff, right? Like I didn't read a lot of these, a lot of this philosophy until I was, in college, right? And I didn't even know who these people were. Like, so that's the first thing. But he kind of gives it to them in like, I mean, it's dense. I mean, to the extent that, philosophy is always dense, but
Yeah.
he gives it to him like in sound bites.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like he wants you to know who this philosopher is. When did this philosopher say what he said? Who was he responding to? Like, every philosopher is usually disagreeing with somebody or agreeing.
Yeah. There's a great book that is geared towards children. I have it here. It's Sophie's World. It's by Justine Gardner, who I believe is Norwegian, and it's kind of done that way. It's through the eyes of an 11-year-old girl, and she goes on these adventures, and each place she stops, it's the lesson of a philosopher, and she asks all these questions. Yeah, I mean, I think philosophy it used to be taught to children, and I'm not saying that they would have the same perspective as an adult who reads it, and hopefully, you would think they probably wouldn't. And in some ways, that's actually not a bad thing, because some of it is not material that they should ascertain at a very young age. But I think having the foundation and being introduced to it opens their horizons and their potential vastly. So.
Yeah, and as we sort of talked about today, I mean, like everything we're talking about right now can be traced back, right, to Plato and before.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the cliche is all philosophy is a footnote to Plato, right?
Yeah.
But and these ideas largely in a
or
lot
the
of
pre-Socratics, but yeah.
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 And the idea here is that, and most of the time it's almost semantic. They're almost just semantic differences. I mean, there could be some other, not just semantic differences, but the idea is that if you understand history and you understand the arc of philosophy over history, and you root that in formal logic, which is something else that should be taught, right? And basic understanding of grammar, your children, your students should be pretty ready to be autodidacts. They should largely be able, to the extent that they want to learn something and have the drive and discipline to put in the hours to, whether it's rote memorization or just trudging through a text, they should be able to pretty effectively teach themselves pretty much anything, or at least get a nice solid grasp on it. And, if with something, the reason I mentioned that Bruce Gore is because it's free, it's online, they're like 40 minutes. Little videos, right? You put it on, you watch it, you talk about it, you read maybe some excerpts from the philosopher he's talking about, practice a little bit of some grammar, some phonics, rooted in your 3 laws of logic, and that could be when you start, as they get older and you want to start to maybe focus more on some of the modern sciences, you want to start looking at like psychology or biology or things like that, right? Like you start looking at not just like Aristotle's, Historia Animalia, like, the taxonomy of animals, you can do that when you're kids, but you're going to start looking at cell structure. Okay. But for much of, like, there's data. It's always been this way. I mean, for the longest time, it's still this way. And they're sort of becoming, sort of a political football right now, right? You've probably heard that everybody's reading scores fell behind. Right, during COVID lockdowns. Well, there's all sorts of data that says that if students can't read relatively proficiently by the 4th grade, they pretty much are not going to catch up.
Right.
And if their literacy is not up to a decent level,
right,
they're not going to be able to keep up with any disciplines. I don't care if it's the arts, languages, philosophy, history, science, math. They're not going to be able to.
Sure.
But what that suggests also, though, is that, look, if you could get your children up to about a 4th, all the way up until 4th grade, you can get them, relatively on par with where they should be on a basic average, that they should be able to pretty soon kind of carry themselves to the extent that they actually want to learn. Right. Yeah. So what I'm saying, you don't have to be, a scholar to bring your children up that level. And once they're at that level, again, they're going to have enough skills to, to the extent that they have the discipline and motivation to learn something, you're going to be able to do it. And wherever they hit that bump, you bring them to the pod or the homeschool, you bring in a teacher or a tutor or something like that. And that, I think, is the solution for the school scenario. I mean, I do say that, while you're doing it, doesn't mean you can't go to the school boards. And if you take your children out and you're still paying taxes, right, you have every right to go and say, like, do you think that the curriculum should be altered? And maybe that's the way we vote with our dollars, so to speak. I mean, that attendance money is important. So the more people that leave and do the homeschool thing, and the more money that they lose, if you stick around and say, look, like, maybe if y'all like kind of go back to classical method and like, the 3 R's and all that type of stuff, like maybe we'll consider, coming back on board, and hopefully that you can reform the public system while you're, educating your children outside of it. Beyond that, I've said this a lot, is that this is where we get to the broader spectrum. I mean, you gotta, as much as possible, you gotta unplug from all these devices and all these tech stuff, right? And to the extent that you're going to use them, you want to be as encrypted as possible, right? As part of, in other words, give them as little data as possible while using what you need to use for the purposes you need to use them. Like, I never had a social media until I had my book, and I only use it for the book to, promote articles in the book. And I tried to do that thing like on a daily basis for a while. I like just the thought of having to check it every day.
It's a lot.
I haven't. If you ever look at it, I mean, I'll go months sometimes without touching my Twitter. I mean, unless I do something new. Like, to me, there's no reason to be on there. Most people aren't listening to what other people say. Most people are just saying inflammatory things. So, if as long as you're living through the screen, feeding them the data and giving the phone or the device to the kids as a babysitter, you got people sitting around the dinner table or the fire, and everybody's on their own device. Like, I could give you a 5-10 point program. It will not matter. Right. You're basically sort of, passively leaning into the whole system. And then in the meantime, when you're on social media and when you're having public discourse in the political sphere and things, or, at your workplace, like, I can't stress this enough, that rhetoric is, it's ethos, logos, pathos. It's logic, emotion, logos being logic, and pathos being emotion. Ethos is usually broken down into like character, credibility, authority. It's basically appeal to trust, though. Okay, and based on those 3 categories. To the extent that we want some of the ideas that we've talked about today in terms of reforms, or some of the warnings that we've talked about to fall on receptive ears, like what's just as important as being logically sound, meaning having specific evidence that you can point to and having non-contradictory reasoning to explicate that evidence. That is actually not going to do anything if you don't have the appropriate pathos and ethos when you're talking with people. In other words, most people won't listen to anything you say if they identify you as somebody that's untrustworthy, and then they therefore have a negative fear response or an anger response. And most of political discourse now, right, is basically you just take that pyramid and you flip it, right? And so it's like, identify what is the person, left or right? Are they a Trump or Biden? Are they woke or traditional? And then based on that, I have a feeling of why I do or don't like that person. And then I fill in the logic of, right, why I agree or disagree, right? So like when we have these conversations, like you gotta practice, like, civility and grace. And I just had to add that, because when people always ask me, what do we do? I always feel like nothing I say matters if we keep escalating this polarization of the country. It's you know, it's getting scary as far as like the inability to communicate across these different, you know, worldviews. And if we can't bridge that gap, you know, I don't like to think about what happens. You know what I mean? So
Absolutely. No, I think
the end game is they get to, when that happens, when that escalates, they get to come in and play, they being the corporate globalist state, they get to come in and play referee and, you know, and have a total digital police state, you know, on technocratic steroids, right? So that's just, that will only accelerate everything even further. That is not a fruitful outcome. So
yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think that's really, really important. People need to start. I always say the antidote to their solution to their, well, they think it's a solution, but to their agenda is because it's a transhuman, ultimately post-human agenda, is for us to become radically human. And that includes how we engage with each other, you know, and I think part of this othering is to dehumanize each other so that we don't have a human interaction, because that really is the antidote. If we treat each other as humans, it's a lot harder to just tackle each other. You know, you can disagree with somebody, but if you care about that person, you're going to be a lot more likely to actually listen and to have some compassion and to try to find some common ground. Because even if you care about your perspective, you're doing it from a place of concern, not a place of I want to prove I'm right and, you know, squash you essentially. So,
right.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
So.
yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I think we covered a lot of ground. If you have anything else you want to impart, of course, please do. And please tell us where we can get your great books, your articles, and find you. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks again for having me. It's been fun as always.
Yeah.
We had a couple long talks at the conference, and a lot of people are starting today, so it's always fun talking to you. Let's see, so schoolworldorder.info is my website, and there's links to everything there, you know, so you can get the book at Trying Date through there. It's on Amazon. There's a link to the database there. There's also all my articles, most of them as of late I've largely written exclusively for Unlimited Hangout, but I have several other publications there. There's links to, I've got a BitChute and a YouTube, and you know, I'm very slow at producing videos, but as we talked about before the show, next year I'm hoping to be a little more regular with making video content and articles, and then my social media stuff is, again, it's all on the website. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Very cool. Very cool. Very fun.